Hey guys, tonight we dive into the miserable world of Roman slavery. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. There is a version of Rome that lives in our imagination before we ever open a history book. A master raises his hand, and no law on earth answers for what happens next. A slave exists the way a chair exists, or a mule, or a length of rope. Useful, replaceable, and entirely without say in his own fate. This is the Rome of gladiator films and grim textbook footnotes. The Rome where cruelty needed no justification because the law had already handed the master a blank page and told him to write whatever he wanted on it. It is a powerful image. It is also, in its simplest form, wrong. Not wrong because Roman slavery wasn't brutal. It was, in ways that still make historians pause mid-sentence when they read the sources aloud. Not wrong because the law protected the enslaved the way it protected the free. It didn't, not remotely, not for most of Rome's history. But wrong in the sense that the picture of total, unlimited, answerable to no one ownership is a simplification that erases something genuinely strange about how Roman society actually functioned. Because buried inside the legal code of the most slave-dependent civilization the ancient Mediterranean ever produced, there is a quiet, persistent, and growing list of things an owner legally could not do. This is not a story about kindness. Rome was not moving toward abolition, and nothing in this script should be read as an argument that Roman slavery was survivable, humane, or anything other than a system built on the total extraction of human life for someone else's benefit. But within that brutal architecture, the Romans themselves, the same senators, jurists, and emperors who upheld slavery as a foundational institution of their economy, began drawing lines. Lines around what a master could do to a body he legally owned. Lines that, when you trace them across 5 centuries, tell you something the popular imagination usually skips entirely: that Roman slavery was not a static horror. It was a moving, contested, legally debated system, and the boundaries around it shifted constantly, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, shaped by war, religion, economics, and the personalities of individual emperors who each left their own fingerprint on how much a person could own another person. Before we go there, though, it helps to name plainly why this particular question, what a Roman master couldn't do, matters at all, beyond simple historical curiosity. Slavery in the ancient world is often taught, and often absorbed by casual audiences, as a single flat category, as if the word slavery describes one consistent, unchanging experience across every civilization that ever practiced it. It doesn't. Roman slavery differed enormously from slavery in classical Athens, differed enormously from slavery in the medieval Islamic world, and differed enormously in law, in scale, in social integration, in the pathways it offered toward eventual freedom, from the chattel slavery later practiced in the Americas, a system many modern viewers picture instinctively whenever the word slavery appears on screen. None of these differences make Roman slavery gentler, easier, or less devastating for the people who lived inside it. But understanding the specific legal architecture of Roman slavery, its particular rules, its particular exceptions, its particular blind spots, gives us a far more accurate picture of how this ancient superpower actually organized its most fundamental relationship of human exploitation, and that accuracy matters, because flattening every historical slave system into a single undifferentiated horror, however well-intentioned the impulse behind doing so, actually obscures rather than illuminates the specific mechanisms of control, resistance, and partial restraint that shaped millions of individual Roman lives across 5 centuries. To understand why these limits existed at all, you have to first understand what Roman law actually said about a slave in the earliest centuries of the Republic, because it is genuinely as bad as you think. Under the earliest formulations of Roman civil law, a slave was classified as res, a thing, not a person with diminished rights, a thing. The same broad legal category that covered furniture, livestock, and land. A master's power over that thing was called dominica potestas, the power of ownership, and in the earliest surviving fragments of Roman legal thought, this power appears close to total. A master could sell a slave, rent a slave, gift a slave, work a slave to exhaustion, whip a slave for any reason or no reason, and, in the bluntest and most disturbing readings of the early sources, kill a slave, because destroying your own property, however that property screamed or bled or begged, was not considered a crime against another person. It was, at most, a strange and perhaps wasteful act. The way burning your own barn down might be considered strange or wasteful, but not something the state had any interest in punishing. This is the baseline. This is where Rome starts. And if the story ended there, this would be a very short and very grim video. But it doesn't end there, because Rome, across the 500 years that followed, kept adding conditions, exceptions, procedures, and outright prohibitions onto that original blank check of Dominica Potestas. And the reasons why reveal something almost more unsettling than if the limits had never existed at all. Rome did not restrain slave owners primarily because Roman society developed a moral objection to slavery. It restrained them for a tangled set of reasons that had almost nothing to do with the humanity of the enslaved and almost everything to do with the interests, fears, and image of the free Roman world around them. Consider, for instance, the earliest and perhaps most surprising source of restraint, religion. Long before any emperor issued a formal edict protecting a slave's body, Roman religious custom had already established that certain sacred spaces existed outside the reach of ordinary violence. A temple was a place under the protection of a god, and to drag a person out of it by force, even a person legally owned by another man, was to risk offending that god. This was not a law written by a senator with a slave's welfare in mind. It was a law that existed to protect the sanctity of temples, the reputation of priests, and the fragile relationship between the Roman state and the divine order it believed governed the world. But the effect, whatever the intention, was that an enslaved person who reached sacred ground sometimes gained a form of protection that no other space in Roman society offered them. A master could not simply walk into a temple and drag his slave out by the hair without consequence, because the consequence wasn't about the slave at all, it was about the temple. This pattern repeats itself again and again as we move through Roman history, and it's worth sitting with because it changes how you read every single limit we're about to discuss in this script. The Romans did not protect enslaved bodies because they came to see enslaved people as fully human in the way we would use that word today. They protected certain aspects of enslaved life because doing so served some other interest the Roman state cared about deeply: public order, elite reputation, religious propriety, economic stability, or the personal image of an emperor who wanted to be remembered as just. The slave, in most of these cases, was not the subject of the law. The slave was the object around which some other concern was being managed. And yet, and this is the strange, uncomfortable truth this script keeps circling back to, the effect of these laws, whatever their underlying motive, was that real, living, enslaved human beings gained real, tangible protections from real, specific forms of violence. A law can be selfish in its origin and still change what happens to a human body on a Tuesday afternoon in Ostia. The name attached to the law itself gives us a small window into how Roman legislation of this kind typically came about, even if the surviving evidence leaves the exact circumstances frustratingly incomplete. Roman laws were conventionally named after the magistrate who proposed them, meaning the Lex Patronia carries the name of an otherwise obscure figure whose broader political career left little trace in the surviving record. A reminder that many of the most consequential pieces of Roman legislation affecting the lives of enslaved people were not grand, celebrated acts of a famous emperor, but comparatively minor procedural measures proposed by officials history otherwise forgot almost entirely, passed through the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of Roman lawmaking, and then quietly absorbed into centuries of subsequent legal practice. Take the arena. For much of the Republic, a master could send a disobedient or troublesome slave to fight as a gladiator or to be torn apart by wild animals as public entertainment, entirely at his own discretion, because the slave was his property to dispose of as he wished, and the arena was simply one more marketplace for that disposal. But by the time we reach the reign of Augustus, something changes. A law, the Lex Patronia, which we will explore in far more depth in the next chapter, requires a master to obtain the approval of a magistrate before condemning a slave to the beasts. On its surface, This looks like a genuine limit on cruelty, and in its effect, it was one. But dig into why the law exists, and you find something more complicated. Roman authorities had grown wary of masters using the arena as a private tool of punishment, dumping personal grudges onto the public stage, turning what was supposed to be a controlled spectacle of state power into an unpredictable outlet for individual rage. The law wasn't primarily born from concern for the slave being torn apart. It was born from a concern about order, about who controlled violence, and where, and under what supervision. But the man standing in the sand, the one who would have died without a magistrate's signature, experienced that law as the single most important sentence ever written about his life. This is the lens through which this entire script wants you to view Roman slavery's boundaries. Not as evidence of Roman compassion, evidence of that is thin and inconsistent at best, but as evidence of a legal system slowly, unevenly, and often reluctantly discovering that total, unregulated ownership of another human being created problems even for the society that depended on it. Masters who tortured slaves to death in public created scandal. Masters who mutilated valuable slaves destroyed economic assets the state had an interest in preserving. Masters who terrorized entire households of enslaved people sometimes triggered the very thing Rome feared most: revolt, poisoning, arson, the kind of quiet retaliation that turned a private household into a crime scene. Every limit we are about to walk through in this script exists somewhere along that spectrum. Religious propriety, public order, economic sense, elite reputation, and, very occasionally, very late, and very partially, something that starts to resemble genuine concern for suffering. And here is the detail that makes this story worth 2 hours of your evening rather than 2 minutes. These limits were never static. A law passed under Augustus could be reinforced, ignored, expanded, or quietly abandoned by the emperors who followed him. A magistrate in one province might enforce a protection rigorously, while a magistrate 300 miles away let it lapse into meaningless paperwork. The gap between what the law said on a bronze tablet in Rome and what actually happened on a farm in Sicily or a mine in Spain could be enormous, and it is one of the great, honest admissions of Roman history that we simply do not know. In the majority of individual cases, whether these protections meant anything at all to the people they were theoretically designed to shield. What we do know is that the attempt existed. The words were written. The precedent was set. And across the long arc of Roman legal history, that precedent kept expanding, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, until the empire that began by classifying human beings as furniture ended, centuries later, with emperors issuing rulings that a master who killed his slave without cause could be treated, under law, as something disturbingly close to a murderer. That is the transformation this script wants to trace. Not a story of Rome discovering morality. A story of Rome discovering, case by case, edict by edict, scandal by scandal, that even a system built on total ownership could not actually sustain total ownership in practice. That somewhere between the theory of the law and the reality of a household, boundaries kept forming, whether anyone intended them to or not. We're going to walk through those boundaries one at a time. We are going to look at the arena, at sanctuary, at the peculium, at family, at the body, at complaint, at freedom itself, and ask, in each case, what could a Roman master genuinely not do to the person he owned? And why did that limit come to exist at all? Before we go further, it's worth pausing on one more thing, because it shapes everything that follows. The limits we are about to discuss did not apply evenly across the enslaved population of Rome. A slave working in an aristocratic household in the city, visible to neighbors, subject to gossip, protected in some small way by his master's concern for public image, lived under a very different practical reality than a slave sent to work the silver mines of Spain, where no magistrate ever visited, no temple offered sanctuary, and no neighbor would ever hear a scream loud enough to matter. The law existed. Its reach did not. And so as we walk through each of these boundaries across the coming chapters, hold 2 facts in your mind at once. That Rome genuinely wrote laws restraining what a master could do to a slave, and that for a significant portion of the enslaved population, those laws might as well not have existed at all. Both things are true. Both things are Rome. There is one more thing worth noting before we move forward, because it will help you make sense of a pattern that recurs throughout this entire script. Rome never produced anything resembling a single, unified slave code. There was no single bronze tablet, no single scroll, that a Roman citizen could consult to find every rule governing what he could and could not do to the people he owned. Instead, what we are about to trace is scattered across centuries of individual legal rulings, scattered across the writings of jurists who often disagreed with one another, scattered across the personal edicts of emperors who each brought their own priorities to the question, and scattered across regional customs that varied from province to province, city to city, household to household. Piecing this story together means reading fragments preserved in later compilations. Above all, the great 6th century legal compilation known as the Digest of Justinian, which gathered together centuries of earlier Roman legal opinion into a single organized reference, alongside biographical accounts, agricultural manuals, funerary inscriptions, and the occasional surviving letter or speech that happens to mention how a particular master, or a particular emperor, handled a particular case. This is not a tidy story with a single source document at its center. It is a mosaic, assembled piece by piece from evidence never designed to answer the specific question we are asking of it. What, precisely, could a Roman master not do? That mosaic quality matters because it means every claim in this script comes with an implicit asterisk. When we say a law existed, we mean a law existed somewhere in the historical record, attested by jurists writing sometimes decades or centuries after the fact, describing rules that may have applied with varying force in Rome itself, in the Italian countryside, in the provinces of Gaul or Egypt or Syria, or may have existed largely as an ideal that individual magistrates chose to enforce or ignore according to their own judgment. This unevenness is not a flaw in the sources. It is a fact about how Roman law actually worked, a sprawling, evolving, often contradictory body of practice administered across an empire that, at its height, stretched from the hills of Scotland to the deserts of the Euphrates, governed by officials who each brought their own interpretation, their own priorities, and their own tolerance for enforcing rules that limited the power of men very much like themselves. With that caveat firmly in place, we can begin the actual work of this script, walking, chapter by chapter, through the specific boundaries Roman law constructed around the power of the master, tracing where each boundary came from, who benefited from it, how strongly it was actually enforced, and what it tells us, in the end, about a civilization that built its entire economy on the ownership of human beings, and yet could never quite convince itself, across 5 centuries of trying, that ownership alone was reason enough to permit absolutely anything. What follows is not a story of Roman kindness dressed up to make an ugly history feel more comfortable. It is a story about how even the most totalizing systems of control humans have ever built develop cracks, legal, religious, economic, social, and how those cracks, however narrow, however unevenly applied, however selfishly motivated, still mattered enormously to the people standing inside them. Let's go back to the beginning of Roman law, to the word dominica potestas itself, and trace exactly how that phrase, the power of the master, was slowly, deliberately, and permanently redefined by the very civilization that invented it. Chapter 2. The line Rome drew. Dominica potestas and its limits. Dominica potestas. Say the phrase slowly, and it sounds almost administrative. 2 Latin words describing a legal category, the kind of dry terminology you'd expect buried in a footnote of an old law book. But behind those 2 words sits one of the most consequential legal concepts in the ancient world, the formal, codified power of a Roman citizen over the human beings he owned. To understand what a master genuinely could not do to a slave in Rome, you first have to understand exactly how far Dominica potestas extended in theory, because the limits we're about to explore only make sense once you've felt the weight of the power they were carved out of. In the earliest surviving Roman legal texts, fragments of the 12 Tables, the foundational law code traditionally dated to the mid-5th century BCE, the enslaved person is treated with a bluntness that still startles readers today. The 12 Tables draw a sharp distinction between personae, persons, and res, things, and while the enslaved occupied an ambiguous, almost liminal category, recognized in certain narrow contexts as human, but legally classified in matters of ownership as property, the practical effect for centuries was that a slave's body, labor, and even life belonged to the master in a way that closely mirrored ownership of livestock or land. Roman jurists writing centuries later, looking back at this early period, described the ancient power of a paterfamilias, the male head of a household, as extending not just over his slaves, but historically over his own children as well, a power of life and death known as ius vitae nascisque. The fact that Roman law once treated the authority of a father over his son with the same vocabulary used to describe a master's authority over a slave tells you something important. This was not, originally, a system designed around the specific horror of race-based chattel slavery as it would later exist in other parts of the world. It was a system built around the broader Roman concept of absolute household authority applied to anyone, free or enslaved, who fell under a master's legal power. But there is a critical difference between the father's power over his son and the master's power over his slave, and it's a difference that matters enormously for this script. Social and religious custom heavily restrained how a father actually used his power of life and death, and by the late Republic, actually killing a son had become almost unthinkable and deeply scandalous in practice, regardless of what the old law technically permitted. The master's power over a slave carried none of those same social breaks for a very long time. A son was still, in every social sense, a Roman. A slave was not. And so while both categories theoretically fell under similarly absolute legal power, only one of them enjoyed the protective web of kinship, reputation, and social expectation that made the exercise of that power rare in practice. The slave stood exposed to Dominica potestas in its rawest form, with none of the informal cushioning that softened the equivalent power over a free child. So what did Dominica potestas actually permit, in its fullest early expression? A master could compel labor without limit. There was no concept of a workday, no legal ceiling on hours, no rest requirement written into the earliest law. A master could relocate a slave anywhere in the Roman world, separate him from any family he had formed, and sell him to any buyer for any reason, with no requirement to justify the sale. A master could physically punish a slave through beating, branding, chaining, or confinement, and in the earliest period, no external authority reviewed whether that punishment was proportionate to any offense, real or imagined. A master could, in the darkest and most extreme readings of early Roman law, kill a slave outright, and the closest the state came to intervening was an occasional, informal social disapproval rather than any codified criminal consequence, because you cannot, under the logic of res, commit murder against your own furniture. This is the wall we are standing in front of. This is the power that, over the following 4 centuries, Roman jurists, emperors, and lawmakers began, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, chipping away at, piece by piece, exception by exception, until the wall that once looked solid and total had been carved through in so many places that by the 2nd century of the Common Era, a master's power over his slave, while still vastly greater than any power we would recognize as acceptable today, was no longer legally unlimited in any meaningful sense. The first real cracks appear not from moral philosophy, but from something far more Roman, the fear of disorder. By the late Republic and into the early Empire, Roman elites were increasingly aware that a household or a city filled with brutalized, terrified, and desperate enslaved people was a household or a city sitting on a fuse. The historical memory of the great slave revolts, the uprisings in Sicily during the 2nd century BCE, and above all the rebellion led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, which required multiple Roman armies and years of brutal campaigning to finally suppress, sat in the background of every Roman conversation about how much cruelty a slave-based economy could safely sustain. Spartacus was not, primarily, remembered by Roman writers as a moral lesson about the injustice of slavery. He was remembered as a warning about what happens when a society pushes its enslaved population past the point of quiet endurance. And warnings like that, filtered through the pragmatic, order-obsessed mind of Roman governance, eventually translate into policy. You can see this pragmatic logic directly in one of the earliest documented restraints on a master's absolute power, the gradual discouragement, and eventually formal restriction, of a master's ability to condemn a slave to death without any external process at all. This didn't happen through a single dramatic law declaring slaves to be full legal persons. That never happened in Rome, not even close, not ever. It happened through a slow accumulation of specific, narrow rulings, each one chipping a little more territory away from the old absolute power, each one justified by a different immediate concern, but all of them pointing in the same long-term direction, toward a legal world in which the master's power, while still vast, was no longer entirely without oversight. The jurist Gaius, writing his Institutes in the 2nd century, offers one of the clearest windows we have into how Roman legal thinkers of the High Empire understood this evolution. Gaius explicitly acknowledges that in the earlier period, masters possessed the power of life and death over their slaves without qualification, but he then goes on to describe, with the careful, almost bureaucratic tone typical of Roman legal writing, how this power had since been curtailed by specific imperial rulings, restrictions that we will examine individually in the chapters ahead. From the Lex Petronia's limits on condemning slaves to the beasts, to the rulings of Emperor Claudius on abandoned and sick slaves, to the transformative edicts of Antoninus Pius that redefined the killing of a slave without legitimate cause as something the state would now actively punish. Gaius doesn't frame any of this as a story of moral progress. He frames it, in the dry, procedural language of a working lawyer, simply as a description of how the law currently stands compared to how it used to stand, which, in its own way, is even more revealing. To Gaius, this wasn't an ideological transformation. It was just an accumulation of individual rulings that, added together, had quietly moved the legal ground beneath every Roman household. The jurist Gaius wasn't writing in isolation, either. He was part of an active, ongoing tradition of Roman legal scholarship, one populated by figures whose names appear again and again throughout this script, including Ulpian, Paulus, Papinian, and others whose surviving opinions, preserved in fragments within Justinian's later compilation, together constitute one of the richest bodies of legal commentary to survive from the ancient world on any subject. These jurists did not always agree with one another. Roman legal scholarship, much like modern legal scholarship, involved genuine debate, competing interpretations, and evolving consensus across generations, and the specific boundaries around a master's power that this script is tracing were, in many cases, actively contested and refined through exactly this kind of ongoing juristic argument rather than settled once and left untouched. Reading these fragments today, centuries removed from the original context, we lose most of the texture of that debate. We see the surviving conclusions far more often than we see the arguments that produced them. But it's worth remembering that behind every ruling this script describes as established sat real intellectual disagreement among real Roman legal scholars, arguing, across letters, treatises, and formal legal opinions, about exactly how far a master's power should extend. It's worth understanding why these individual rulings kept accumulating in this particular direction, because the answer reveals something structurally important about how Roman imperial power actually worked. Each emperor who issued a ruling limiting a master's treatment of slaves was not, generally, acting out of some deep personal conviction about the humanity of the enslaved. Emperors issued rulings, again and again across Roman history, in direct response to specific scandals. A master who had become notorious for extreme cruelty, a case that had generated public outrage or unwelcome gossip in the Senate, a pattern of behavior that threatened to embarrass the image of Roman civilization the emperor wanted to project, both to his own citizens and to the wider world. Emperors cared, deeply and consistently, about how their reign would be remembered, and a reputation for restraining the worst excesses of slaveholding cruelty was, for several emperors, a genuinely useful piece of that public image. Proof of the emperor's clementia, his mercy, a virtue Roman political culture prized highly, at least in its rhetoric, even when the reality of imperial rule was frequently anything but merciful. This matters because it explains something that might otherwise seem confusing. Why did these restraints tend to expand under some emperors and stagnate, or even reverse under others? The answer is that they were never rooted in a fixed, unchanging legal principle that slavery itself needed reform. They were rooted in the personal priorities, political needs, and public image management of individual rulers, layered one on top of another across centuries. Augustus wanted to be remembered as a restorer of order after decades of civil war, and laws like the Lex Patronia fit that broader project of visible, disciplined governance. Claudius, according to several ancient sources, was personally disturbed by reports of masters abandoning sick or elderly slaves to die rather than pay for their care, and issued a specific ruling addressing that exact abuse. Antoninus Pius, who ancient historians consistently describe as one of the most restrained and legally conservative emperors Rome ever produced, issued some of the most significant protections we'll discuss in this script, apparently motivated by a genuine, if still deeply limited by modern standards, belief that a master's power needed clearer boundaries. None of these emperors abolished slavery. None of them questioned, in any surviving text, whether the underlying institution itself was legitimate. What they did was something narrower, and in its own way stranger. They kept insisting, ruling after ruling, that even within a system built on ownership, there existed a category of treatment that crossed a line that shifted depending on who was drawing it, but which, once drawn, tended to stay drawn. A right, once granted, was rarely fully revoked in Roman legal history, even if its enforcement wavered wildly depending on the province, the era, and the willingness of local magistrates to actually act on it. This is the pattern you should hold in your mind as we move forward through this script. Not a single moment of transformation, but an accumulation. A law here restricting the arena, a ruling there restricting abandonment, an edict addressing murder, a precedent addressing complaint. Each one narrow, each one specific, each one usually born from some scandal or political need rather than abstract moral reasoning, and yet, added together across the span of Roman imperial history, forming something that genuinely changed what a master could and could not legally do to the human beings he owned. By the time we reach the era of the great jurist Ulpian in the early 3rd century, Roman law had developed a body of precedent sophisticated enough that a master who killed a slave without justification could, in specific documented cases, be tried and punished by the state. A legal reality that would have been almost unimaginable under the blunt, unrestrained Dominica potestas of the early Republic. It is worth pausing here to consider how unusual this pattern actually was within the broader landscape of ancient Mediterranean law, because Rome did not invent slavery, and Rome was hardly alone among ancient civilizations in wrestling with how far an owner's power should extend. Other ancient legal traditions took very different approaches to this same underlying tension. Some Near Eastern law codes, including portions of the much older Babylonian legal tradition associated with Hammurabi, included specific provisions addressing the treatment of enslaved people that in some respects appear more protective, on paper, than early Roman law, while other ancient societies extended even less formal restraint than Rome did in its earliest centuries. What made Rome's trajectory distinctive was not that it started from an unusually cruel baseline, and not that it ended at an unusually generous one, but that its legal system produced an unusually well-documented, centuries-long paper trail of jurists actively arguing, refining, and building precedent upon precedent regarding exactly where the boundaries of ownership should sit. Few ancient legal traditions left behind anything comparable to the layered, argumentative, endlessly cross-referenced body of Roman juristic writing that survives in fragments today, and it is precisely because of that unusual documentary richness that we can trace this evolution in as much detail as we're attempting in this script. Consider, too, how this evolution intersected with Rome's own sense of its national identity. Roman writers across multiple centuries returned again and again to a self-image built around law itself. The idea that what separated civilized Rome from the barbarian peoples beyond its borders was precisely this commitment to structured, written, consistently applied legal process. A Roman aristocrat might have felt no particular moral discomfort with the institution of slavery itself, which he likely regarded as a natural and permanent feature of any functioning society. But he might have felt genuine discomfort with the idea that Roman governance, in this one specific domain, operated with less structure and process than it did in matters of property disputes, inheritance, or contract law, areas where Roman legal sophistication was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily advanced. This gap between Rome's self-image as a civilization of careful, structured law and the comparatively blunt, unstructured reality of early Dominica potestas may itself have functioned as a quiet, long-term pressure pushing later jurists and emperors toward bringing the law of slavery into closer alignment with the procedural sophistication Romans prided themselves on in every other legal domain. There is also a demographic reality worth sitting with, because it shaped exactly how urgent these questions felt to the Roman ruling class at different points in their history. Modern historians estimate that enslaved people constituted somewhere between a fifth and a third of the total population across large portions of Roman Italy during the height of the Republic and early Empire. A staggeringly high proportion by almost any historical comparison, meaning that a Roman citizen walking through the streets of Rome, Pompeii, or Ostia would have been surrounded, at almost every turn, by enslaved people performing an enormous range of roles: domestic servants, agricultural laborers, skilled craftsmen, teachers, physicians, accountants, and administrators managing complex business affairs on behalf of their owners. A population of that scale, embedded that deeply and that intimately into the daily functioning of Roman society, was never going to remain a purely abstract legal category indefinitely. The sheer proximity, the sheer functional dependence of Roman households and Roman commerce on enslaved labor created constant, grinding pressure toward developing more sophisticated rules governing that relationship. Not because proximity naturally produces compassion. History offers far too many counterexamples for that comforting assumption to hold, but because proximity on this scale inevitably produces friction, disputes, scandals, and practical problems that a purely blunt, unrestrained legal category could not adequately resolve. We are about to walk through exactly how that happened, boundary by boundary, scandal by scandal, emperor by emperor. We start with the arena, and with a law that took the single most public form of violence in Roman culture, the spectacle of a body torn apart before a cheering crowd, and quietly, deliberately, took it out of a master's unrestricted hands. Chapter 3, the Lex Petronia and the ban on the arena. Picture the amphitheater on a festival morning. Sand raked smooth. Crowds packing the stone tiers before the sun has fully cleared the rooftops. Somewhere beneath the arena floor, in the dark network of holding pens and corridors that Roman engineers built beneath their entertainment venues, a man waits who has done nothing wrong except belong, by law, to someone who decided his life was worth less than an afternoon spectacle. Before the reign of Augustus, this scene required no signature, no review, no permission beyond the master's own decision. A troublesome slave, a disobedient slave, a slave who had simply become inconvenient. Any of them could be delivered to the beast hunts or the gladiatorial games at their owner's sole discretion, condemned not by any court, but by the private will of the man who owned them. The Lex Petronia changed that. And to understand why it changed, and what it actually did and did not accomplish, we need to slow down and look closely at one of the more overlooked turning points in the legal history of Roman slavery. The law is generally dated to sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era, its precise origins debated among historians, but its substance well attested in later legal writing, including the digest of Justinian compiled centuries afterward, which preserved fragments of earlier Roman legal commentary specifically addressing this statute. What the Lex Petronia established, in its core provision, was straightforward. A master could no longer hand a slave over to fight wild beasts in the arena purely on his own authority. Doing so now required the approval of a magistrate. A formal review, however cursory it may have been in practice, inserted between the master's private wish and the slave's public death. Stop and sit with how significant this actually is as a legal principle, separate from how well it was enforced. For the first time in a documented, formal way, Roman law was declaring that a specific category of extreme violence against a slave's body was no longer purely a private matter between an owner and his property. It required outside review. It required justification. It required, in effect, an admission that a master's decision to inflict death upon a slave was now something the Roman state had a legitimate interest in examining before allowing it to proceed. That is an enormous conceptual shift from the old, unrestrained logic of Dominica potestas. Even if the actual bar a master needed to clear in front of a magistrate may often have been low. So why did this particular law target this particular form of violence? The arena occupied a very specific place in Roman civic life, And understanding that place helps explain why lawmakers focus their attention here before almost anywhere else. Gladiatorial games and beast hunts were, formally, state-sanctioned and heavily regulated spectacles. They were tied to religious festivals, funded partly through public and partly through private patronage, and staged as demonstrations of Roman order, discipline, and dominance over nature, over conquered peoples, over death itself. The condemned criminals who were sentenced damnatio ad bestias, death by wild beasts, as formal judicial punishment represented the state's own violence, carefully staged and controlled. A master who simply dumped his own slave into that same arena, without any judicial process, was doing something the Roman authorities found genuinely troubling, not primarily because of concern for the slave, but because it blurred a line the state cared about protecting: the distinction between officially sanctioned punishment, carried out with the full ceremony and legitimacy of Roman law, and private, arbitrary violence dressed up in the same public spectacle. There's a further layer to this story that rarely makes it into popular retellings of Roman gladiatorial culture. The arena itself operated as a highly capitalized commercial enterprise, with trained gladiators representing a genuinely significant financial investment for the owners and managers, called lanisti, who ran gladiatorial schools and supplied fighters for public games. A slave condemned to the beasts by his own master, entirely outside this commercial gladiatorial system, represented a very different category of arena death than the carefully trained, expensively maintained professional gladiators whose combats formed the centerpiece of most major games. This distinction mattered practically as well as legally. Officials managing a given set of games had genuine logistical and financial interests in how the spectacle was structured, and a master's private condemnation, injected into that carefully planned commercial and civic program without any coordination, could disrupt the schedule, the expected entertainment value, and the financial arrangements that a day of games represented for everyone involved in staging it. The requirement for magistrate approval, seen from this angle, also functioned as a form of basic logistical coordination, ensuring that private condemnations fit within, rather than disrupted, an increasingly organized and commercially significant civic institution. This is worth dwelling on, because it reveals the underlying logic that runs through so many of the legal boundaries this entire script is exploring. Rome was not, at this stage, primarily concerned with protecting slaves from violence in general. Masters retained enormous latitude to beat, chain, confine, and physically punish the people they owned throughout this entire period, and nothing in the Lex Patronia touched any of that ordinary domestic brutality. What the law specifically targeted was the public, spectacular, state-adjacent form of violence represented by the arena. A master using his private authority to stage what looked, to an audience of thousands, like an official judicial execution, was appropriating something the Roman state considered its own prerogative. The magistrate's approval requirement wasn't primarily a shield for the slave. It was a fence around a specific category of state authority that the law didn't want private citizens casually reaching into. And yet, here is the detail that makes this law worth genuine attention rather than cynical dismissal: the effect on the ground, for the individual slave standing in that holding pen beneath the arena, was real and specific. Before this law, his fate rested entirely on his owner's mood, grudge, or financial calculation. After this law, at least in the parts of the empire where it was actively enforced, his fate required someone with formal legal authority to review and approve the request. We don't have detailed records of exactly how often magistrates refused these requests, and it would be historically dishonest to pretend this created any kind of robust due process. Roman magistrates were themselves elite men embedded in the same slaveholding culture as the masters bringing these requests to them. And a magistrate inclined to simply rubber stamp whatever a fellow aristocrat wanted would have faced no particular pressure to do otherwise. But the requirement existed. The paperwork existed. The principle that this specific decision could not be made in total privacy, with total impunity, existed, and once it existed in Roman law, later jurists built on it rather than discarding it. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, because it recurs throughout this entire script. Roman legal reform relating to slavery almost never worked by asserting a broad, sweeping principle like slaves have inherent rights that must be respected. That kind of abstract, Universal reasoning essentially does not appear in the surviving Roman legal tradition regarding the enslaved. Instead, Roman law worked the way it worked on almost every subject, through narrow, specific, often reactive rulings addressing a particular abuse or a particular category of harm, one at a time, accumulating gradually into something that only looks like a coherent body of protection when you step back far enough to see the whole pattern across centuries. The Lex Patronia didn't say masters cannot kill slaves. It said, specifically and narrowly, masters cannot send slaves to the beasts without a magistrate's approval. That narrowness is very Roman, and it's also very telling about how limited even the most significant of these protections actually were in their original scope. Later jurists, writing in the centuries after the law's passage, treated it as an established and unremarkable part of Roman legal practice, which is itself a meaningful historical signal. Legal commentary from the classical period of Roman law, including writers whose opinions were later preserved in Justinian's Great Compilation, cite the Lex Patronia's restriction as settled law, discussing its application and its boundaries with the same dry, procedural tone jurists used for tax law or property disputes. This tells us the restriction had become normalized, not controversial, not actively fought over in the way we might expect a hard-won protection to be, but simply absorbed into the everyday functioning of Roman legal practice, the same way modern legal systems absorb old statutes into unremarkable procedural habit. It's also worth addressing directly what this law did not do, because the gap between a law's existence and its actual reach is one of the most important through lines of this entire script. The Lex Patronia said nothing about a master beating a slave to death in the privacy of his own home. It said nothing about slaves worked to death in the mines, on agricultural estates, or in the brutal conditions of the ergastula, the underground slave prisons that existed on many large rural estates, where chained field slaves were held overnight in conditions ancient writers themselves described with visible discomfort. It applied to one very specific, very public form of violence, in one very specific, very visible venue, and nowhere else. A master frustrated by this new restriction on the arena lost nothing of his broader power to terrorize, control, or physically punish the people he owned through any of the countless other channels still fully available to him under Roman law. This is the honest, unglamorous truth about almost every legal boundary we're going to examine in this script. Each one closed a single door, while leaving a dozen others wide open. And yet the door mattered. It mattered to the specific human beings who would otherwise have died in that specific way, at their owner's private discretion, with no review at all. It mattered as a legal precedent that later rulings could build upon. Because once Roman law had established that some form of oversight could be inserted between master and slave regarding matters of life and death, the conceptual door was open for later emperors to insert oversight into other categories as well. A pattern we'll trace directly in the chapters ahead when we reach the transformative rulings of Antoninus Pius. And it mattered, perhaps most quietly, as evidence that the Roman elite themselves, the same class of men who owned the vast majority of Rome's enslaved population, had concluded, collectively, through the passage of this law, that total unrestricted private violence, at least in this one specific form, created more problems for Roman society than it solved. There's a final layer to this story worth including before we move forward. The Lex Patronia exists in a broader Roman legal tradition of restricting specific, visible, scandal-generating categories of cruelty far more readily than it restricted the vast, invisible, everyday violence that actually defined most enslaved lives. This pattern, visible restricted, invisible ignored, will show up again and again in the chapters ahead, in sanctuary law, in the Antonine reforms, in the complaint procedures established under later emperors. Rome's legal system was, in this sense, deeply attuned to appearances. A master who tortured a slave to death quietly, on a rural estate, far from any magistrate's notice, faced essentially no practical risk under any of these laws for centuries. A master who did something publicly shocking, dumping a slave into the arena, mutilating a slave in a way that became gossip among the elite, killing a slave in a manner dramatic enough to reach a magistrate's attention, faced a legal system increasingly willing, at least on paper, to draw a line and say, "Not like this. not so visibly, not without our approval first. It's also worth situating the Lex Patronia within the broader Roman anxiety surrounding the arena as an institution during the Augustan period specifically, because Augustus himself invested enormous political energy in reshaping how gladiatorial games and beast hunts functioned within Roman civic life. Augustus, according to his own account of his achievements preserved in the Residential Gesti, boasted extensively about the scale and frequency of the games he sponsored during his reign, treating these spectacles as a central pillar of how he displayed his authority, his generosity, and his connection to the Roman people. An emperor investing this heavily in the arena as a tool of political legitimacy had every reason to want tight control over exactly what happened within it. And a private master using the arena to settle personal scores or dispose of unwanted property represented precisely the kind of unregulated, unpredictable element that could undermine the careful, choreographed image Augustus was working to construct. Viewed this way, the Lex Patronia looks less like an isolated act of restraint and more like one piece of Augustus's much larger project of bringing every visible form of public violence in Roman society under closer imperial supervision. A project that had far more to do with consolidating the emperor's own authority than with any particular concern for the well-being of the enslaved people caught within it. The requirement for magistrate approval also created, almost as a byproduct, something Roman legal culture valued highly in other contexts but had rarely applied to slaves before: a documentary record. Once a master needed formal permission to condemn a slave to the beasts, that request presumably needed to be made in some recorded form, reviewed by an identifiable official, and approved or denied through an identifiable act of Roman administration. We should be cautious about overstating how rigorous this documentation actually was in practice. Surviving evidence doesn't give us detailed insight into exactly how thorough or perfunctory these reviews typically were, and it is entirely plausible that in many cases, a wealthy and well-connected master could obtain approval with minimal genuine scrutiny. But even a minimal, perfunctory bureaucratic process represents something categorically different from the complete absence of any process at all, and it establishes a template that later, more substantive protections could build upon, expand, and strengthen, exactly as we'll see happen under Antoninus Pius in a later chapter. There's a comparative point worth raising here as well, because it helps clarify what actually made the arena distinctive as a category of violence that Roman lawmakers chose to restrict relatively early. Public beast hunts and gladiatorial combat were, by their nature, spectator events. Violence performed in front of an audience specifically for that audience's entertainment and edification. This performative quality mattered enormously to how Roman authorities thought about regulating it, because an audience watching a slave die in the arena was, whether Roman officials framed it this way explicitly or not, an audience being taught something about what kind of violence Roman society considered legitimate, orderly, and worth witnessing collectively. A master's private violence against a slave in his own household, however brutal, remained hidden from that same collective witnessing, and hidden violence, however common, generates far less pressure toward formal regulation than violence performed publicly in front of thousands of Roman citizens simultaneously. This dynamic, public, witnessed cruelty facing far more legal scrutiny than private, hidden cruelty, is a thread that runs consistently through nearly every chapter of this script, and the Lex Patronia represents one of its earliest and clearest expressions in the documented legal record. Understanding that distinction between the visible cruelty Rome restrained and the invisible cruelty it mostly left untouched is essential groundwork for everything that follows. In the next chapter, we turn to another one of these visible, publicly witnessed boundaries: the strange and genuinely remarkable practice of sanctuary, where a desperate slave, having exhausted every other option, could run, not to freedom, never quite to freedom, but to the base of a statue or the steps of a temple, and force the entire machinery of Roman law and religion to briefly, imperfectly, stand between him and the man who owned him. Chapter 4, Sanctuary, running to the statue of Caesar. There is a particular kind of desperation that produces strange legal inventions, and Roman sanctuary law is one of the strangest and most quietly remarkable examples the ancient world left behind. Picture a slave who has endured months, perhaps years, of escalating cruelty. A master prone to violent rage, punishments disproportionate to any real offense. A household that has become, for this one person, a place of constant dread. Running away outright meant almost certain capture, brutal punishment if caught, and the permanent legal status of a fugitive, a status Roman law treated with real severity. But there was, by the time of the early empire, another option, narrower, stranger, and dependent entirely on geography and imperial favor, but real. The slave could run not away from Rome, but toward its most sacred and symbolically loaded spaces, and once there, claim a form of protection that existed nowhere else in the ordinary landscape of Roman slaveholding. Picture, for a moment, the physical geography of a city like Rome itself during the High Empire, because it helps explain why this practice took the specific shape it did. Rome was not a city with one central temple and nothing else. It was a city saturated with sacred and imperial imagery, its forums, crossroads, and public squares crowded with statues of gods, deified emperors, and monuments to military victory, each one theoretically a potential point of refuge depending on how strictly or loosely local officials chose to interpret the law's reach. A slave in genuine crisis, fleeing a household in a moment of acute danger, was navigating a mental map of the city built around exactly this kind of knowledge. Which statues stood closest, which temple's priests were known to take these claims seriously, which route offered the fastest path to safety before a pursuing master or his own household staff could catch up. This is a detail easy to lose in a purely legalistic discussion of sanctuary as an abstract category, but worth holding on to, because it grounds the whole practice back in the lived, physical, breathless reality of what it must have actually meant to attempt it. The practice drew on much older Mediterranean traditions of religious sanctuary, the ancient idea that certain spaces, temples above all, existed under the direct protection of a god, and that violence committed within those spaces was not merely a crime against the victim, but an offense against the divine order itself. Greek temples had offered this kind of protection for centuries before Rome absorbed and adapted the tradition, and Roman religious practice carried forward the basic principle. Some ground was sacred enough that ordinary human authority, even the authority of a master over his own property, had to pause at its threshold. What makes the Roman version of this tradition particularly interesting for our purposes is how it evolved to include not just traditional religious sites, but explicitly political and imperial spaces as well. By the early empire, a slave fleeing severe mistreatment could seek refuge at the statue of the emperor, a practice attested in multiple surviving legal and historical sources, describing enslaved people running to imperial statues scattered throughout Roman cities and provinces, clinging to the base of the image, and by doing so, invoking a form of protection tied directly to the emperor's own person and authority. This is a genuinely strange fusion of religious and political symbolism. The emperor, increasingly treated in Roman civic life as something between a ruler and a semi-divine figure, extended a form of his own protective authority through his statues, such that touching that stone or bronze likeness created a legal moment that a master could not simply override by force. The historian Suetonius, writing biographical accounts of the early emperors, references this practice directly in his account of Claudius, describing how that emperor addressed situations involving sick and abandoned slaves, a topic we'll return to shortly, within a broader context of imperial rulings shaping how masters could and couldn't treat the people they owned. Later legal sources, including material eventually preserved in the Digest of Justinian, describe the practice of fleeing to an imperial statue or a temple with more procedural specificity, outlining what officials were supposed to do once a slave had claimed this form of refuge. So what actually happened, mechanically, once a slave reached that statue or that temple? This is where the story becomes genuinely revealing about the limits, and the very real limits, of what sanctuary actually offered. A slave who successfully reached sanctuary did not become free. This point cannot be overstated, because it's easy to romanticize this practice into something it never was. Sanctuary did not sever the master's legal ownership. What it did was far narrower and more procedural. It prevented the master from simply removing the slave by force in that moment, and it triggered a requirement for some kind of official review of the situation, typically involving a local magistrate or, in Rome itself, potentially the prefect of the city, whose expanding role in slave-related complaints we'll examine in more depth in a later chapter. The official reviewing the case had a range of possible outcomes available. In some documented instances, if the master's cruelty was found to be severe and substantiated, the outcome could be a forced sale. The master would be compelled to sell the slave to a new owner, removing that specific person from that specific abusive household, though still, crucially, leaving them enslaved under someone else. In other cases, the review might simply result in the slave being returned to the same master, perhaps with some informal warning, particularly if the magistrate reviewing the case had no strong incentive to challenge a fellow member of the Roman elite over the treatment of his property. This unevenness is essential to understanding sanctuary honestly. It was not a guaranteed path to safety. It was a desperate gamble, dependent entirely on the disposition of whichever official happened to be reviewing the case, the severity and visibility of the abuse being alleged, the social standing of the master involved, and the specific historical period in which the case occurred, because, as with every protection we're discussing in this script, the actual practical strength of sanctuary waxed and waned significantly depending on which emperor currently sat on the throne and how seriously. Imperial policy of that era treated complaints against slaveholders. Under emperors more inclined toward what Roman political culture called clementia, a public reputation for mercy and restraint, sanctuary claims appear to have been taken more seriously, with real consequences for masters found to have committed severe abuse. Under less engaged or more indifferent administrations, the practice likely persisted in form while losing much of its practical force, becoming, for many desperate slaves, a gesture with no real teeth behind it. We should be honest about the limits of our sources here. We do not have detailed statistical records of how many sanctuary claims succeeded, how many failed, or how the ratio shifted across different reigns. What we have are legal texts describing the mechanism as it was supposed to work, biographical anecdotes describing specific instances, and the broader pattern of imperial rulings that continued to reference and refine the practice across multiple centuries, which at minimum tells us this was not a forgotten, symbolic law sitting and used on the books, but an active enough part of Roman legal life that jurists kept finding reason to discuss, clarify, and adjust it. It's also worth noting how sanctuary interacted with the broader institutional landscape of Roman religious authority, because temples were never simply empty stone buildings. They were staffed, managed, and represented by priests who held real social standing and real practical influence over what happened within their sacred precincts. A priest presiding over a temple that a desperate slave had just entered claiming sanctuary held a genuinely delicate position. Caught between the religious obligation to respect the sanctity of the space under his care, the practical political reality of potentially angering a socially prominent master demanding the return of his property, and whatever personal judgment he formed about the merits of the specific case in front of him. Surviving sources give us frustratingly little insight into how individual priests typically navigated this tension, but the very existence of this three-way pressure, religious duty, social pressure, personal judgment, helps explain why sanctuary's practical effectiveness varied so widely from case to case, temple to temple, and priest to priest, in ways that a purely legal reading of the statutes themselves could never fully capture. There's a particularly striking detail worth including here: the fact that sanctuary specifically extended to imperial statues, rather than only to traditional religious temples, tells us something important about how Roman emperors used this legal mechanism as a tool of their own image management, connecting directly back to the broader pattern this script keeps returning to, where protections for enslaved people often existed as a byproduct of some other Roman priority rather than as a direct, primary concern for the enslaved themselves. An emperor whose statue offered genuine refuge to a desperate, mistreated slave was, whether he intended it this way or not, broadcasting a very specific message to the entire Roman world, that his authority, his person, his image, stood for a kind of restraint that even a private master's power could not override. This served the emperor's political interests, reinforcing his image as a guarantor of order and justice, distinguishing his rule from the perception of chaotic, unchecked private violence, even as it happened to provide a real, if limited and unreliable, form of protection to the specific slave desperate enough to make that run. It's worth pausing to imagine the practical reality of what this actually required from a slave in crisis. Reaching sanctuary meant identifying, in the middle of an emergency, exactly where the nearest qualifying statue or temple actually stood, knowledge that would have varied enormously depending on whether you lived in the dense urban environment of Rome itself, packed with imperial statuary and temples on nearly every prominent street corner, or on an isolated rural estate hundreds of miles from the nearest city, where the nearest qualifying sacred space might be an impossible distance away, effectively making this entire legal protection meaningless for the large percentage of Rome's enslaved population who worked the land far from any urban center. This geographic unevenness is a crucial, sobering counterweight to any narrative that risks making Roman sanctuary sound more universally protective than it actually was. For a domestic slave in a wealthy Roman townhouse, a statue might be a desperate but genuinely reachable option mere streets away. For an agricultural slave chained in an ergastula on a rural estate in Sicily or Gaul, the entire concept of sanctuary might as well not have existed in any practical sense at all. And yet, even acknowledging every one of these limitations, the existence of sanctuary as a legal category tells us something worth sitting with. Roman law had created a mechanism, however narrow, however unevenly enforced, however geographically limited, by which an enslaved person, acting entirely on their own initiative, without a master's permission or knowledge in advance, could interrupt the normally uninterrupted flow of a master's authority and force, at minimum, a moment of official attention onto their situation. That single fact represents a meaningful conceptual departure from the pure logic of Dominica Potestas we examined in the previous chapter. Under that older logic, a slave had no standing to interrupt anything. Under sanctuary law, a slave, in the right city, near the right statue, with enough desperate courage to make the attempt, had a legally recognized, if imperfect, way to force the question of their own treatment into the open, in front of witnesses, in front of officials, in a way that a private household could not simply absorb into silence. It's worth thinking carefully about the psychological and social weight the act of running to sanctuary must have carried for the person attempting it, because this was never a decision made lightly. Choosing to publicly flee to a statue or a temple was, in itself, an unmistakable, unmissable public declaration that something had gone badly wrong within a master's household. A declaration made in front of witnesses, in front of strangers, in front of anyone passing through that street or that public square at that moment. This carried real risk even beyond the immediate question of whether the sanctuary claim would ultimately succeed. A master publicly embarrassed by a slave's flight to sanctuary, regardless of the eventual outcome, might well respond with escalated cruelty toward that same slave later, assuming the review process returned the slave to his ownership, or might retaliate against other enslaved people within the same household as a warning against attempting anything similar in the future. Roman sources give us little direct testimony from the enslaved perspective on this calculation. The vast majority of surviving Roman literature was written by and for the free elite, and the voices of the enslaved people actually making these desperate decisions survive only in fragments, if at all, but we can reasonably infer, from the structure of the law itself and from what we know about power dynamics within Roman households, that reaching sanctuary represented a genuine last resort, rather than a routine or lightly used option. We should also address a specific and often cited episode that illustrates both the reach and the limits of this practice. Accounts describing Emperor Nero's reign include references to abuses of sanctuary law, with sources describing wealthy individuals and even freedmen exploiting the practice for purposes that had little to do with genuine protection from abuse. Using proximity to imperial statues or temples as a kind of legal loophole to escape debts or other obligations unrelated to slaveholding cruelty at all. This detail matters because it shows that sanctuary, as a legal mechanism, was not narrowly confined to its original purpose and was subject to the same kind of opportunistic manipulation that affects legal loopholes in any era. A reminder that the existence of a protective legal mechanism never guarantees that it will be used exclusively, or even primarily, for the purpose it was originally designed to serve. Subsequent emperors, aware of this kind of abuse, periodically issued clarifying rulings attempting to narrow and formalize exactly who could claim sanctuary and under what specific circumstances, another small example of the constant, iterative refinement that characterized so much of Roman legal development in this area across the centuries. The broader Mediterranean context adds one more useful layer of understanding here. Temple sanctuary as a general legal and religious concept long predated Rome's adoption and adaptation of it, with deep roots in Greek religious practice reaching back many centuries before Roman power extended across the Mediterranean world. When Rome absorbed Greek territories and Greek cultural influence during the Republic, Roman elites absorbed a great deal of Greek religious and legal thinking alongside it. And the sanctuary tradition represents one clear example of this kind of cultural transmission, an old Greek religious principle, reshaped and adapted to fit the specific political and administrative structures of Roman imperial governance, eventually extended even to explicitly Roman and imperial symbols like the statue of a living emperor, a fusion that would have made little sense within the original Greek religious framework, but fit naturally within Rome's own evolving relationship between religion and imperial political authority. This is the through line that will carry us into the next chapter, where we examine the single most significant transformation in this entire legal story, the reign of Antoninus Pius, and the moment when Roman law stopped treating the killing of a slave as a matter of destroyed property and began treating it, for the first time, in specific, documented, unmistakable legal language, as something the state itself would investigate, judge, and punish. Chapter 5. The Antonine Reforms. When killing became murder. There's a broader question worth raising before we dive into the specifics of this reign, because it sits underneath everything this chapter is about to describe. Why does a single emperor's individual disposition matter so much in a legal system as large, as institutionally deep, and as procedurally sophisticated as Rome's? The answer lies in how Roman imperial authority actually functioned in relation to law. Unlike a modern legislature operating through extended deliberative process across many independent representatives, an emperor's personal rulings, his rescripta, his responses to specific legal questions brought before him, his edicts addressing particular categories of dispute, carried enormous, often decisive legal weight, treated by subsequent jurists as authoritative precedent to be cited, applied, and built upon for generations afterward. This meant that Roman law, in a way quite different from many other legal traditions, remained genuinely responsive to the individual character, priorities, and moral instincts of whichever single man happened to hold imperial power at any given moment, a structural feature that could produce rapid, meaningful legal change under a reformist emperor, and equally rapid stagnation or reversal under an indifferent or hostile one. Every legal system has a moment, if you look closely enough, where a quiet accumulation of small changes suddenly crosses a threshold and becomes something categorically different. For the story of what Roman masters could and could not do to the people they owned, that threshold arrives most clearly during the reign of Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 of the Common Era, and whose surviving legal rulings represent one of the most significant single expansions of protection for enslaved people in the entire history of Roman law. To understand why Antoninus Pius matters so much to this story, you first need to understand the kind of emperor he was, because his personality and his priorities shaped the specific direction of his legal reforms in ways that are unusually well documented for a Roman ruler. Ancient sources, including the biographical collection known as the Historia Augusta, consistently describe Antoninus as a ruler defined by restraint, careful attention to law, and a deliberate cultivation of the image of a just and moderate emperor, someone who governed, by the accounts we have, without the paranoid violence of a Domitian or the erratic cruelty of a Caligula, and who was remembered by later Roman writers with a level of consistent praise that few emperors received. Whatever the full reality behind that curated reputation, and Roman imperial biography, especially the Historia Augusta, is a genre we should approach with real caution regarding its accuracy. The surviving legal record shows a ruler who issued a specific, focused set of rulings addressing the treatment of slaves. Rulings substantial enough that later jurists treated the reign of Antoninus Pius as a genuine turning point when discussing this area of law. The centerpiece of this legal shift is a ruling, preserved and discussed in later legal compilations, in which Antoninus Pius addressed the killing of a slave by a master without legitimate cause. Where earlier Roman legal tradition had treated such a killing as, at most, a matter of private concern, the destruction of one's own property, subject to social disapproval perhaps, but not formal criminal process. Antoninus established that a master who killed a slave signed causa, without cause, could now be held to the same legal standard applied to someone who killed another person's slave. This might sound like a narrow, technical distinction, but it represents an enormous conceptual leap. Roman law had long recognized that killing someone else's slave was a form of property destruction, addressed under laws like the Lex Aquilia, which established compensation obligations for damaging another person's property, including their enslaved workers. What Antoninus did was take that existing legal framework, designed to protect a master's financial interest in a slave he owned when someone else damaged that property, and extend a version of its logic to protect the slave from the master's own unjustified violence. In effect, the emperor was saying, even your own property is no longer entirely yours to destroy without consequence. This ruling didn't emerge from nowhere, and understanding its immediate trigger tells us something important about how Roman legal reform actually happened in practice. Ancient legal sources associate this shift with specific, documented cases of extreme cruelty that had come to the emperor's attention, incidents severe enough to generate the kind of scandal that repeatedly, throughout this script, we've seen functioning as the actual engine driving legal change in Rome. The jurist Gaius, writing not long after this period, directly connects the new legal standard to public awareness of masters who had killed slaves through torture or extreme punishment, incidents that had apparently become notorious enough to demand an imperial response. This is the pattern again, not abstract moral philosophy driving reform from first principles, but specific, visible, reputation-damaging cruelty forcing the hand of an emperor who cared, deeply, about the image of justice and restraint his reign projected. It's worth pausing on the specific legal mechanism Antoninus used to achieve this shift, because the technique itself, reasoning by analogy from an existing law rather than creating an entirely new legal category from scratch, is a distinctively Roman approach to legal innovation that appears throughout this script. Rather than declaring an entirely new crime of murdering a slave, which would have required Roman law to formally acknowledge a slave's legal personhood in a way the broader system was nowhere near ready to do, Antoninus instead extended the logic of an existing, well-established legal framework, the Lex Aquilia's treatment of damage to another person's property, into a new context, applying its underlying reasoning to a master's treatment of his own property. This is a subtle but important distinction. Roman law rarely advanced through bold declarations of new principle, and almost always advanced through exactly this kind of careful analogical extension, stretching existing legal categories to cover new situations without ever fully abandoning the conceptual framework that had always governed the underlying relationship. It's a conservative, incremental style of legal reasoning, and understanding it helps explain why Roman protections for enslaved people, even at their most significant, so consistently stopped short of anything resembling a declaration that slaves possessed rights in the way a citizen did. Alongside this central ruling on killing, Antoninus Pius issued a broader set of related protections that together constitute one of the most significant single expansions of restraint on masters in Roman legal history. He addressed, in documented rulings, the treatment of slaves subjected to extreme and excessive cruelty short of death, establishing that a master guilty of genuinely severe mistreatment, even mistreatment that stopped short of killing, could be compelled by state authority to sell the slave to a different owner. This connects directly to the sanctuary practices we examined in the previous chapter and anticipates the formalized complaint procedures we'll explore in a later chapter regarding the role of the prefect. Antoninus's reign appears to represent the period when these various threads of protection, which had existed in scattered, informal, or inconsistently enforced forms under earlier emperors, became more clearly and systematically established as recognized legal principle. It's worth being precise about what compelled sale actually meant as a remedy, because on the surface it might sound like a genuinely protective outcome, and in a narrow, immediate sense, it was a slave suffering under a documented, extremely cruel master could, through this mechanism, be removed from that specific household. But we should resist the temptation to read this as anything resembling liberation. Compelled sale did not free the slave. It transferred ownership from one master to another, with no guarantee whatsoever that the new owner would prove any less cruel than the one being replaced. The remedy Roman law had developed for extreme cruelty was, in the end, still just another sale. The same fundamental transaction of human commerce that defined every other moment of an enslaved person's life, deployed here as a form of protection rather than a form of profit, but never escaping the basic logic of ownership that governed the entire system. This is, in miniature, the central tension running through this entire script. Real, documented, legally significant restraint on masters, existing entirely within, and never threatening, the fundamental structure of ownership itself. Legal historians examining these anonym rulings have noted something else worth including here. The language used in the surviving legal text increasingly frames the master's excessive violence not simply as a private matter between owner and property, but as something that threatens the broader social and moral order, a formulation that echoes, in its underlying logic, the same public order concerns we saw driving the Lex Petronius restrictions on the arena. Ulpian, the great jurist of the following century, whose writings form a substantial portion of what survives in Justinian's later legal compilation, discusses these anonym principles as established, foundational law by his own time, treating a master's unjustified killing of a slave as something requiring genuine legal scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. Evidence that whatever Antoninus Pius established during his reign had, by the early 3rd century, become thoroughly embedded in mainstream Roman legal practice rather than remaining an isolated, unusual ruling. There is a specific, often cited detail from this period worth dwelling on because it illustrates the broader logic so clearly. Legal texts from this era address not just the killing of slaves, but the specific practice of masters exposing sick or elderly slaves, abandoning them, effectively, to die without care once they were no longer economically productive. A grim but apparently common cost-cutting practice among masters unwilling to pay for medical treatment or basic sustenance for slaves who could no longer work. Emperor Claudius, ruling roughly a century before Antoninus Pius, had already addressed a version of this specific abuse, establishing, according to Suetonius's account, that a slave abandoned in this way due to sickness would, upon recovering, gain freedom rather than reverting to the ownership of the master who had discarded him, and further establishing that a master who killed a sick slave outright rather than simply abandoning him to die could face prosecution as if he had committed an ordinary killing. This Claudian ruling, predating Antoninus by roughly a century, shows that the trajectory we're tracing wasn't invented from nothing in the 2nd century. It had roots reaching back further, with different emperors across different reigns, each contributing their own piece to an accumulating body of restraint. Exactly the pattern this script has been building toward since its opening chapter. What made the Anonym reforms distinctive wasn't that they invented an entirely new category of legal thought from nothing, but that they consolidated, clarified, and significantly strengthened a set of principles that had existed, until then, in a more scattered and unevenly applied form. By the end of Antoninus Pius's reign, Roman law had moved to a place where a master's power over the life of his slave, while still vastly greater than any modern legal system would tolerate for even a moment, was no longer the totally unrestrained, unquestionable authority it had been under the original logic of the 12 Tables. A master who killed a slave without legitimate cause now faced the genuine possibility of state prosecution. A master whose cruelty became sufficiently severe and sufficiently documented now faced the genuine possibility of losing that slave through compelled sale. These were not abstractions. These were legal mechanisms with real, if imperfectly and unevenly enforced, consequences attached to them. And yet, the honest caveat that must accompany every chapter of this script: we should not overstate how transformative this actually was in the lived, daily experience of most enslaved Romans. Prosecution required someone to bring a case forward, evidence to be gathered, a magistrate willing to pursue it seriously against a fellow member of the propertied class, and a level of visibility that, as we discussed in the previous chapter, was far more available to an urban domestic slave than to someone laboring in a remote agricultural estate or a mine. The Antonine reforms established the legal possibility of consequence in a way that simply had not existed before. Whether that possibility translated into actual protection for any specific enslaved person on any specific day, in any specific corner of the vast Roman world, remained, as it had throughout this entire story, a matter of luck, geography, visibility, and the disposition of whichever official happened to be paying attention. Still, the legal principle mattered, and it mattered specifically because of what it represented conceptually. The moment Roman law formally acknowledged that killing a slave without cause was closer, in its essential legal character, to killing a person than to destroying property. That's a genuinely significant redefinition, achieved not through some sweeping declaration of universal human rights, a concept entirely foreign to Roman legal thinking, but through the accumulated, specific, case-by-case rulings of a handful of emperors who, for reasons ranging from personal disposition to political image management to specific scandalous incidents, kept deciding, again and again across more than a century, that this particular line needed to be drawn a little more firmly than it had been drawn before. It's worth examining more closely how this legal shift actually functioned in a practical courtroom context, to the extent our sources allow us to reconstruct it, because the mechanics reveal just how far Roman legal process still had to travel before anything resembling genuine equal justice existed between master and slave. A case alleging that a master had killed a slave without legitimate cause would typically have required some other party, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps another member of the household, perhaps, in some documented instances, a relative of the deceased slave if such a relative existed and had the standing or courage to bring a complaint forward, to initiate the process. Since the enslaved victim obviously could not testify on his own behalf regarding his own death, and Roman legal procedure generally required a living accuser to set any prosecution in motion. This structural requirement alone would have filtered out the vast majority of potential cases, since bringing an accusation against a socially prominent master carried real risk for anyone without significant standing of their own. And the pool of people both willing and positioned to bring such an accusation forward was almost certainly small relative to the actual scale of unjustified killing that likely occurred across the empire during this period. Even so, the specific legal standard Antoninus Pius established, requiring some demonstration of legitimate cause before a killing could be considered lawful, represented a genuine inversion of the earlier default. Under the old logic of unrestricted dominica potestas, the burden of justification, if it existed at all, rested nowhere. A master simply acted, and no one needed to explain anything to anyone. Under the new Antonine standard, at least in principle, the absence of cause became the legally significant fact, meaning that a master who found himself facing formal scrutiny now needed to actively demonstrate that some legitimate reason existed for his conduct, rather than simply asserting his unquestioned right to act however he wished. This shift in where the burden of explanation sits is a subtle but structurally important feature of how legal systems evolve, and Roman law's movement in this direction during the Antonine period anticipates, however faintly and however incompletely, legal principles that would take many more centuries to develop into anything resembling their modern form. The broader context of Antoninus Pius's reign also matters here. His rule followed the more expansionist and militarily active reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, and ancient sources consistently frame Antoninus's approach to governance as a deliberate, self-conscious turn toward internal consolidation, legal refinement, and administrative stability rather than continued territorial conquest. An emperor oriented this strongly toward internal governance and legal precision was, almost by definition, more likely to devote sustained attention to exactly the kind of detailed, procedural legal questions that produced rulings like the ones we've examined in this chapter. This is not to suggest that Antoninus Pius was uniquely humane in some way his imperial predecessors and successors entirely lacked. Roman imperial history offers far too many examples of cruelty, indifference, and violence across every reign to support such a simple narrative. but rather to note that the specific combination of personal disposition, political circumstance, and administrative priority that defined his particular reign created unusually favorable conditions for exactly this kind of incremental legal reform to take hold, get documented, and eventually become embedded as lasting precedent that later jurists like COULDN could build upon with confidence. We turn next to a very different kind of boundary, not one imposed by the state through criminal law, but one that emerged from the economic logic of Roman slaveholding itself. The peculium, the strange, quasi-legal fund of property that many slaves controlled despite technically owning nothing at all, and the surprising restrictions this created on what a master could simply seize from the person he owned. Chapter 6. The peculium. Property slaves could almost own. There is a particular kind of quiet contradiction sitting at the heart of Roman slaveholding practice, and nowhere does it show itself more clearly than in the institution we're about to examine in this chapter. Roman law was unambiguous on one foundational point that we've returned to repeatedly throughout this script. A slave, as a matter of strict legal category, could not own property. Everything a slave possessed, everything a slave earned, everything a slave accumulated through labor, trade, or gift belonged, in the full and formal sense of Roman law, to the master. There was no legal fiction anywhere in the Roman system that granted an enslaved person independent legal personhood capable of holding title to anything. And yet, if you look at how Roman households and businesses actually functioned in daily practice, you find something that looks, in almost every practical respect, remarkably close to slaves owning property. A strange, pragmatic institution called the peculium, and a set of customs and eventually legal principles surrounding it that placed real, meaningful restrictions on what a master could simply seize or destroy. The peculium, at its simplest, was a fund, money, goods, land, sometimes even other slaves, that a master granted to a slave to manage, ostensibly still belonging to the master in the full legal sense, but which the slave controlled, invested, grew, and often used to conduct their own economic activity with a degree of practical independence that can seem startling given the harsh legal category slaves otherwise occupied. Why would a master do this? The answer is almost entirely economic, and understanding that economic logic is essential to understanding why the peculium developed the protections it did, because, as with nearly every boundary this script has examined, the protection here emerged not from concern for the slave's well-being as an end in itself, but from the practical incentives of the system surrounding him. A slave with a peculium had a powerful incentive to work hard, manage resources wisely, and generate profit, because a portion of that profit, in practice, tended to accrue to benefits the slave himself experienced: better living conditions, the ability to purchase small comforts, and, crucially, the accumulated funds needed to eventually purchase his own freedom. A practice we'll examine in much greater depth in a later chapter on manumission. Masters running businesses, shops, workshops, trading operations, agricultural enterprises, increasingly relied on enslaved managers and agents who needed some degree of practical financial autonomy to negotiate deals, manage inventory, and conduct the countless small transactions that Roman commercial life required. A slave without any independent financial standing at all was, from a purely practical business perspective, a much less useful economic agent than a slave who could be trusted to manage a peculium responsibly, precisely because that trust was reinforced by the slave's own stake in the fund's growth. This economic logic produced something genuinely unusual in Roman legal practice. While the peculium remained, in the strictest formal sense, the master's property, Roman jurists developed an increasingly sophisticated body of legal doctrine treating it, in practical terms, as something closer to the slave's own property the master could not simply seize back on a whim without disrupting the entire economic logic that made the arrangement useful in the first place. The jurist COULDN, whose writings on this subject survive extensively in the later digest of Justinian, discusses the peculium at considerable length, addressing questions like what happened to a slave's peculium upon manumission, how debts and obligations connected to a peculium were handled, and how the peculium interacted with the master's own broader legal and financial obligations. A level of detailed legal attention that itself signals how economically and socially significant this institution had become within Roman society. It's worth noting how this system also shaped the internal dynamics of a Roman household beyond the individual slave managing a peculium. A master presiding over a household or estate with multiple enslaved workers, several of whom controlled their own peculia of varying size, was effectively presiding over a small internal economy, complete with its own informal hierarchy of relative wealth and status among the enslaved population itself. An enslaved steward managing a substantial peculium, employing his own labor, negotiating his own contracts, occupied a genuinely different social position within that household than a field worker with no peculium at all, and this internal stratification among the enslaved, itself a direct product of how unevenly the peculium system actually applied, created its own complex web of relationships, resentments, and aspirations that ancient sources only hint at in passing, but which modern historians studying Roman social history have increasingly tried to reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that survives. One of the most striking practical protections surrounding the peculium involved what happened when a slave was manumitted, freed. Roman legal custom and eventually formal legal principle held that, absent a specific agreement stating otherwise, a slave gaining freedom generally retained the peculium he had been managing, rather than the master simply reclaiming it at the exact moment freedom was granted. This might sound like a small, technical point, but its practical significance was enormous. It meant that the entire economic incentive structure driving countless enslaved Romans toward disciplined, productive labor, the hope of eventually accumulating enough through the peculium to purchase or otherwise secure their own freedom, and then to actually keep what they had built once free, depended on masters generally honoring this expectation. A master notorious for reneging on this custom, for stripping a newly freed slave of the peculium he had spent years building, would have faced real practical consequences within Roman commercial and social life, a reputation for bad faith that would make it significantly harder to motivate any future slaves under his ownership toward the same kind of productive, trustworthy economic behavior, and potential damage to his standing among the network of business relationships that Roman commercial slavery depended on. This is, again, the recurring pattern of this entire script, a real, practically significant restraint on a master's theoretical absolute power, emerging not from a law declaring slaves had inherent property rights. No such law existed, but from the practical, self-reinforcing logic of an economic system that functioned better when masters exercised restraint than when they didn't. The peculium worked as an institution precisely because there existed a widespread, if informal, expectation that masters would not simply seize it arbitrarily, and that expectation, reinforced by social custom, business reputation, and eventually specific legal principles addressing its treatment upon manumission, functioned as a genuine practical limit on what an owner could do. Even though no single law ever declared, in so many words, a master may not touch his slave's peculium. It's worth being clear-eyed, as always in this script, about the limits of this protection. A master retained the formal legal right, at any point, to reclaim the peculium in its entirety. The protection here was never a matter of hard legal prohibition, but of custom, incentive, and reputation, all of which could fail a specific slave under a specific master who simply didn't care about the reputational or economic consequences of breaking with expected practice. We have no way of knowing how many enslaved Romans spent years carefully building a peculium only to have it arbitrarily seized by a master indifferent to social convention. The system's protections, as with sanctuary, as with the arena restrictions, existed as strong social and economic expectations rather than airtight legal guarantees, real enough to shape behavior across Roman society broadly, but never strong enough to protect any single individual from a master determined to ignore them. And yet the sheer scale and sophistication of the legal doctrine surrounding the peculium, the detailed rules jurists developed regarding debts, transactions, inheritance, and manumission connected to these funds, tells us that this was not a marginal or rarely used institution. It was a central, structurally important part of how Roman slavery actually functioned as an economic system, particularly in urban commercial contexts, and its existence created a genuine, if informal, category of almost property that many enslaved Romans controlled, and that many masters had strong practical incentives to leave largely undisturbed. The peculium represents something distinct from the other boundaries we've examined in this script so far. Not a criminal law restriction imposed by an emperor concerned about scandal or public order, but an economic institution that emerged organically from the practical needs of Roman commerce, and which, in its own quiet, unglamorous way, placed real limits on a master's power that no single law ever needed to formally declare. To fully appreciate how deeply embedded the peculium became within Roman economic life, it helps to look at the sheer range of activity it enabled. Surviving inscriptions, wax tablets, and legal texts document enslaved agents managing peculia substantial enough to purchase real estate, invest in shipping ventures, lend money at interest, and even, in some well-documented cases, purchase and manage slaves of their own. A genuinely striking legal possibility, since a slave technically owning another slave through his peculium created a strange, layered hierarchy of dependency that Roman jurists had to work through carefully in their commentaries. This wasn't a marginal or theoretical possibility confined to a handful of exceptional cases. Commercial life in cities like Puteoli, Ostia, and Rome itself depended heavily on enslaved and formerly enslaved businessmen operating with exactly this kind of practical financial latitude. And the wax tablet archives discovered at sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum preserve numerous financial transactions conducted by individuals whose legal status was enslaved, but whose economic behavior looked, on the page, indistinguishable from any free Roman businessman negotiating a loan or a property transfer. This economic reality also shaped how masters approached the question of manumission price, an area where the peculium's protections had enormous practical consequences. A slave hoping to purchase his own freedom needed to accumulate, through his peculium, an amount roughly equivalent to his own market value as assessed by his owner, meaning that a master's willingness to let that peculium grow undisturbed over years or even decades functioned as the single most important practical determinant of whether a given enslaved person had any realistic path toward eventual freedom at all. Jurists writing on this subject describe disputes that arose when masters attempted various strategies to prevent a peculium from ever reaching the threshold needed for manumission, inflating the assessed value of the slave arbitrarily, for instance, or finding pretexts to periodically siphon off portions of the accumulated fund. And the fact that these disputes generated enough legal commentary to survive in later compilations suggests that Roman courts, at least occasionally, were willing to intervene against masters attempting this kind of bad faith manipulation, treating it as a violation of the customary expectations surrounding the peculium's proper use, even though, again, no single sweeping law ever declared such manipulation categorically illegal. There is also a revealing pattern in how the peculium functioned differently across different categories of enslaved labor, and this variation tells us something important about how unevenly these economic protections actually reached across the enslaved population as a whole. An urban slave working as a business agent, a shopkeeper, or a skilled craftsman was vastly more likely to control a meaningful peculium than a rural agricultural slave laboring in the fields, or, worse, a slave condemned to work in the mines, where conditions were so brutal that ancient writers themselves, including Diodorus Siculus describing the mines of the Roman world, wrote about them with unusual horror even by the standards of a society thoroughly accustomed to enslaved suffering. For these workers, the peculium as a meaningful economic institution barely existed in any practical sense, and the entire elaborate structure of protection, incentive, and eventual manumission through savings that this chapter has described applied, in reality, to only a fraction of Rome's total enslaved population, disproportionately concentrated among urban, domestic, and commercially skilled slaves, while the much larger population of agricultural and mining labor experienced a version of Roman slavery in which this particular boundary offered essentially no practical protection at all. There's also a legal wrinkle worth including here because it shows how seriously Roman jurists eventually took the practical reality of the peculium, even while refusing to grant it formal status as the slave's own property. The development of what jurists called the actio de peculio, a legal action allowing outside parties who had done business with a slave managing a peculium to sue for enforcement of debts and contracts up to the value of that peculium. even though the slave himself had no independent legal standing to be sued directly in the way a free person would. This might sound like an obscure technical point, but it reveals something significant. Roman commercial law had, by the classical period, developed an entire specialized body of doctrine treating the peculium as a functionally real economic entity, distinct enough from the master's general estate that separate legal mechanisms needed to exist just to handle disputes arising from it. A legal system does not invest this much sustained juristic attention across generations of commentary and case law into something it considers a meaningless fiction. The volume and sophistication of surviving legal commentary on the peculium is itself strong evidence that this institution functioned as something far closer to real property in practice than the bare legal category of slave-owned nothing would suggest on its face. It's also worth considering how the peculium shaped a slave's day-to-day relationship with the wider economic life of the Roman world beyond his own household. A slave with an active peculium interacted with free Roman citizens as a counterparty, a negotiator, sometimes even a creditor, relationships that required a functional, if legally asymmetric, degree of mutual trust and reliability to actually work in practice. Free Roman merchants extending credit to an enslaved business agent, or entering into a trade agreement with an enslaved shop manager, were making a practical calculation that the peculium behind that transaction represented real, dependable value, backed by a set of customary expectations sturdy enough to make ordinary commerce function. This everyday economic entanglement between free and enslaved Romans, repeated countless times across the marketplaces, ports, and workshops of the Roman world, represents one of the more understated but genuinely significant ways that the harsh legal category of slavery coexisted, in daily practice, with a far more complicated and functionally interdependent economic reality on the ground. This economic logic connects directly to the subject of our next chapter, because the same practical, business-minded reasoning that shaped the peculium also shaped Roman attitudes, and eventually Roman legal precedent, regarding another area where a master's total theoretical power ran up against practical and eventually legal restraint: the question of enslaved families, and how far a master could actually go in tearing apart the relationships that enslaved people, against every legal obstacle placed in their way, still managed to build. Chapter 7. Marriage, Family, and the Limits on Separation. Roman law never recognized a marriage between two enslaved people as a legal marriage in the full sense the term carried for Roman citizens. The formal Roman institution of marriage, connubium, required specific legal capacity that enslaved people simply did not possess, and the relationships that enslaved men and women formed with each other, recognized in Roman custom under the specific term contubernium, meaning something closer to cohabitation than marriage, carried no formal legal weight whatsoever. A master could, under the strict letter of Roman law for most of its history, separate a contubernium couple through sale at any time, for any reason, with no legal requirement to consider the relationship at all. Children born to enslaved parents belonged to the master of the mother, regardless of who the father was or what relationship existed between the parents, and could likewise be sold away from either parent without any legal barrier standing in the way. This is, without question, one of the most brutal and thoroughly documented aspects of Roman slavery, and nothing in this chapter is intended to soften that reality. Ancient sources, including funerary inscriptions, legal texts, and literary references, make clear that family separation through sale was a real, recurring, and devastating feature of enslaved life throughout Roman history, inflicted on countless people with no legal recourse to prevent it. And yet, in keeping with the pattern this entire script has been tracing, even within this brutal reality, a set of practical, economic, social, and eventually legal restraints developed over time that meaningfully shaped how, and how often, this kind of separation actually occurred, restraints that grew more substantial as Roman law and Roman commercial practice matured across the centuries. The most immediate and consistent restraint was economic, and understanding it requires thinking carefully about what actually made an enslaved person valuable to a Roman master in practical terms. A stable, established household of enslaved workers, people who had lived and worked together for years, who understood their roles in each other, who had formed working relationships that made a farm, a workshop, or a domestic household run smoothly, represented a genuinely valuable economic asset, an asset that arbitrary, disruptive sales tended to damage. Roman agricultural writers, including Columella in his detailed treatise on farm management, explicitly advised landowners that stable, settled arrangements among their enslaved workforce, including recognized contubernium relationships, tended to produce better labor outcomes than a workforce kept in a constant state of disruption and uncertainty. Columella specifically recommended that enslaved women who bore multiple children be rewarded with better treatment and eventually freedom, reasoning that this created strong incentives for reproduction, family stability, and a self-replenishing enslaved workforce that reduced a master's ongoing need to purchase new slaves from the external market. This is deeply uncomfortable reasoning to sit with. Columella's advice is explicitly instrumental, treating family stability as a breeding and productivity strategy rather than a recognition of human dignity. But its practical effect was that a meaningful portion of the Roman agricultural elite had genuine economic incentives to not casually break apart the families their enslaved workers had formed. Incentives that, however cold their underlying logic, translated into real behavioral restraint on the ground. Beyond agricultural estates, urban and domestic slavery developed its own version of this same economic logic. A domestic household that functioned well, where enslaved staff understood their roles, worked effectively together, and where a master's home ran smoothly because of established relationships among the people who kept it running, represented a genuine asset to a Roman household's daily functioning and social reputation. And disrupting that stability through arbitrary sales carried real practical costs that a rational Roman master had every incentive to weigh carefully before acting on. Impulse. Legal precedent. While never granting enslaved family relationships the formal status of Roman marriage, did gradually develop specific protections addressing certain categories of forced separation, particularly as we move into the later empire and the legal reforms of the Christian emperors beginning with Constantine in the 4th century. Constantine issued rulings specifically addressing the sale of enslaved agricultural workers attached to imperial and eventually private estates, establishing restrictions on separating family members, specifically husbands, wives, and children, through sale in certain circumstances tied to land transfers. Reasoning explicitly grounded in a developing legal and moral concern about the cruelty of tearing apart family units. This represents a genuinely significant late development in Roman legal history, arriving centuries after the earlier reforms we examined in previous chapters, and reflecting the broader transformation of Roman legal and moral thinking that accompanied the Christianization of the empire's ruling class. A transformation this script can only gesture toward here, since a full examination of how Christian moral thought reshaped late Roman slave law deserves its own separate treatment beyond what these opening chapters can cover. Even before these later Christian-influenced reforms, however, Roman legal and social practice had already developed informal customs that discouraged, without fully prohibiting, family separation in specific documented circumstances. Legal texts from the classical period discuss cases involving the sale of enslaved women who were pregnant or had recently given birth, with jurists addressing questions about whether and how such sales needed to account for the child, reflecting an ongoing legal engagement with exactly the kind of family disruption that pure, unrestrained Dominica potestas would have treated as entirely irrelevant to a master's sale decision. The very fact that Roman jurists felt the need to write extensively about these situations, considering questions like whether a nursing infant needed to be sold alongside its mother, how the peculium interacted with a mother's ability to eventually purchase her children's freedom, and how manumission grants sometimes explicitly included provisions for an enslaved person's spouse and children to be freed together rather than separately, tells us that family relationships among the enslaved had become, by the High Empire, a recognized and legally significant category that Roman law could not simply ignore, even while refusing to grant those relationships the full formal status of citizen marriage. Funerary evidence adds another crucial layer to this picture, one that written legal texts alone cannot fully capture. Surviving Roman tombstones and funerary inscriptions, preserved by the thousands across the former territory of the Roman Empire, include countless monuments erected by and for enslaved and formerly enslaved people, frequently using explicitly familial language, husband, wife, son, daughter, to describe relationships that carried no formal legal weight under Roman law but were clearly experienced, mourned, and commemorated with the same emotional depth as any legally recognized family bond. These inscriptions represent some of the most powerful evidence we have that enslaved Romans built family relationships that mattered enormously to them regardless of what the law said about their formal status. And the sheer volume of surviving funerary evidence documenting these relationships suggests a level of social recognition and acceptance for enslaved family bonds within the broader Roman community that went beyond what the strict letter of civil law alone would suggest. None of this should obscure the fundamental brutal reality at the heart of this chapter. For the overwhelming majority of Roman history, a master retained the full legal right to separate an enslaved family through sale, and countless enslaved Romans experienced exactly that devastating separation with no legal recourse whatsoever to prevent it. The economic incentives toward stability that we've discussed here were incentives, not obligations. A master facing financial pressure, a master relocating, a master simply indifferent to the practical benefits of a stable workforce, faced no formal legal barrier preventing family separation for the vast majority of Roman history and the later Constantinian reforms. Whatever genuine improvement they represented arrived only in the 4th century, centuries after slavery had already defined Roman society, and applied initially to fairly narrow categories of circumstance rather than establishing a universal prohibition on separating enslaved families. What this chapter reveals, when placed alongside everything we've examined so far in this script, is a consistent and by now familiar pattern. Roman restraint on a master's power over enslaved family life emerged gradually, unevenly, and largely through economic self-interest and slowly shifting social and legal custom rather than through any early or consistent legal principle protecting family bonds as inherently valuable. The genuine legal protections that did eventually develop arrived late, applied narrowly, and existed alongside a much larger and much older reality in which family separation through sale remained, for most of Roman history, entirely legal and depressingly common. And yet, as with every boundary this script has traced, the arena, sanctuary, the killing of slaves without cause, the peculium, even this partial, late, economically motivated restraint mattered enormously to the specific human beings whose families it managed to protect. Families that funerary inscriptions across the Roman world still preserve the memory of 2,000 years later in the simple, devastating language of husband, wife, son, and daughter, carved into stone by people the law refused to fully recognize, for relationships the law refused to fully protect, but which they themselves clearly refused to let go unmarked, unmourned, and unremembered. Before turning to that final dimension, it's worth acknowledging directly how much regional variation likely shaped this entire picture, a caveat that applies to this chapter perhaps more than any other in this script. The Roman Empire, at its height, encompassed an extraordinary range of local cultures, each with its own pre-existing customs surrounding family, marriage, and household structure long before Roman rule arrived, and imposed its own legal categories on top of them. A province like Egypt, with its own deeply rooted legal and administrative traditions stretching back millennia before Roman conquest, is documented in surviving papyri as having developed distinctive local practices surrounding enslaved family arrangements that don't map neatly onto the patterns we can reconstruct from Italian and specifically Roman sources. Similarly, enslaved populations drawn from different conquered regions, Gauls, Britons, Greeks, Syrians, North Africans, arrived within the Roman system carrying their own pre-existing cultural expectations about marriage and family, expectations that surely shaped, in ways our surviving sources capture only faintly, how individual enslaved people understood, valued, and fought to protect the family bonds they managed to form under Roman ownership. This script, drawing primarily on the legal, literary, and epigraphic sources that survive most abundantly from Rome and Italy specifically, cannot fully capture that broader empire-wide diversity. And it's worth naming that limitation honestly rather than presenting a single unified picture where the actual historical reality was almost certainly far more varied, and locally specific. It's worth adding one further dimension to this picture: the specific and often overlooked role that manumission itself played as a tool for family preservation. A thread that anticipates the fuller discussion of manumission awaiting us in a later chapter, but deserves at least a preliminary mention here. Roman manumission documents, where they survive in enough detail to examine, frequently reveal masters freeing enslaved family units together rather than individually. A father securing freedom for himself, his contubernium partner, and their children in a single coordinated act, sometimes achieved gradually across years as the family's combined peculium grew large enough to cover the cost. Sometimes granted as a single act of a master's testamentary generosity upon his death, a not uncommon feature of Roman wills that explicitly freed enslaved families together as a final gesture. This pattern suggests that at least some portion of the Roman slaveholding population had internalized, whether through genuine sentiment, social pressure, religious conviction in the later Christian period, or simple practical convenience, an expectation that family units, once formed, deserved consideration when questions of sale or freedom arose. An expectation with no binding legal force for most of Roman history, but one substantial enough to leave a real trace in the surviving documentary record. The geography of Roman slavery also shaped family stability in ways worth acknowledging directly. An enslaved family working on a single large agricultural estate, particularly estates that remained within the same family's ownership across multiple generations, faced meaningfully different risks of separation than an enslaved family in a household more likely to change ownership through inheritance disputes, bankruptcy, or the simple churn of urban Roman commercial life, where enslaved individuals were bought, sold, and traded with a frequency that agricultural workcases on stable estates rarely experienced to the same degree. Roman comic playwrights, including Plautus, whose surviving plays frequently feature enslaved characters as central figures, repeatedly dramatize precisely this anxiety: the looming threat of sale, the fear of separation, the desperate scramble to raise money before a feared transaction could occur, suggesting that this fear was familiar enough to Roman theatrical audiences, including audiences that themselves owned slaves, that playwrights could rely on it as an immediately recognizable dramatic device without needing extensive explanation. A joke or a plot point only lands with an audience if the underlying anxiety it plays on is one the audience already recognizes and understands, and the frequency with which Roman comedy returns to exactly this theme tells us something valuable about how widely understood, and how widely feared, the threat of family separation through sale actually was across Roman society, among the enslaved and the free alike. Taken together, the picture this chapter leaves us with is neither the total absence of protection nor anything resembling genuine security. It is, like every boundary this script has traced so far, a landscape of partial, unevenly distributed, frequently self-interested restraint, economic incentive pulling in one direction, legal indifference pulling in another, occasional genuine legal reform arriving centuries late and applying narrowly, and underneath all of it, the constant, grinding reality that a master's legal right to separate a family through sale persisted, entirely intact, for the vast majority of Roman history. The chapters that follow will continue this same pattern of careful, honest accounting, examining the specific bodily protections that emerged around castration and mutilation, the formal complaint procedures that developed under the prefect of the city, the legal pathways toward manumission that owners could not indefinitely obstruct once set in motion, and the informal but powerful weight of public reputation that shaped elite behavior even where written law remained silent. Each one, another piece of the same mosaic, another boundary drawn, however imperfectly, within a system that never stopped being what it fundamentally was: the total, foundational ownership of one human being by another, softened only ever at the edges and never at the center. Chapter 8: Castration Bans and Bodily Protections. Picture a household in Rome during the reign of Domitian, somewhere near the end of the 1st century CE. A wealthy family wants a particular kind of servant for their son, a boy who will sing, who will never grow a beard, who will remain smooth-faced and high-voiced long after his peers have deepened into men. There is a market for this. There has been for generations, stretching back through the courts of the Near East, through Hellenistic palaces, into the households of the Roman elite who prized eunuchs as singers, as chamberlains, as trusted servants who could move through private female quarters without arousing suspicion of impropriety, and, increasingly, by the late 1st century, as symbols of luxury itself. To own a eunuch was to announce that you could afford something rare, something manufactured through violence and healed through careful, expensive medical attention, something that could not simply be bought off a passing slave ship without forethought and investment. This is the world into which Domitian's edict arrived, and it is worth sitting with why it mattered, because it represents something genuinely unusual in the history of Roman law. An emperor placing a limit not on how a slave could be treated in general, not on labor conditions or the intensity of punishment, but on a specific, irreversible mutilation of the body, one inflicted for no purpose other than profit and vanity. The practice of castrating boys for sale as eunuchs had grown into a substantial industry by the 1st century of the empire. Merchants specializing in the trade operated across the eastern provinces and in Rome itself, and the price a castrated boy could fetch, once trained and matured into the specific social role Roman elites wanted from him, dwarfed what an ordinary slave commanded. This price difference is the entire story. Where there is a price difference this large, someone will supply it, and the population from which that supply is drawn, in a slave society, is simply whichever children happen to be owned by someone willing to sell them into the process, or captured and funneled into it before ever reaching an owner who might object. The historian Suetonius records that Domitian, whatever his many other cruelties and contradictions as a ruler, took a personal interest in banning this practice. The biographical tradition tells us he forbade the castration of males within the empire and moved to suppress the trade in eunuchs, going so far as to fix a ceiling on the price that existing eunuchs, already castrated before the ban, could be sold for, a measure aimed at making the residual trade in already mutilated slaves unprofitable enough that it would not sustain itself, even as new castration was outlawed. This is a telling detail. Domitian did not merely declare the practice illegal and leave it there. He tried to starve the economic incentive that had created it in the first place, understanding, correctly, that a law without an economic mechanism behind it in a marketplace this lucrative would simply drive the practice underground rather than end it. The ban did not originate in nothing. There is a longer thread here connecting back to earlier unease about the practice, and it resurfaces and gets reinforced by later emperors, most notably Nerva and Hadrian, both of whom restated, and, in Hadrian's case by some accounts, strengthened the prohibition, with penalties attaching not just to the merchants who performed or commissioned castrations, but potentially to the masters who allowed it to happen to slaves under their control. By the time later jurists compiled the great legal digests of the classical period, castration of a slave without lawful medical cause, meaning cause tied to an actual physical ailment requiring the procedure for the slave's own health, as bizarre as that carve-out sounds to modern ears, had become a criminal matter, not merely a private wrong between an owner and his human property that the state had no interest in. Why does this matter as a marker of limitation on ownership? Because it cuts directly against the logic of Dominica Potestas discussed earlier in this account. The idea that a master's power over his human property was, at least in the earliest conception of Roman law, total, encompassing life, death, and everything of lesser severity in between. If an owner's power was truly total, there is no principled reason the state should care whether he chose to have a slave castrated any more than it cared whether he chose to have a slave's hair cut or ears pierced. The fact that the state did care, that it went so far as to criminalize the practice and attach penalties even reaching toward masters themselves, tells us something had shifted in how Roman lawmakers thought about the boundary between property and person, at least with respect to this one specific, visible, irreversible violation of bodily integrity. It is worth being honest, though, about why this particular protection emerged when so many others did not, or emerged so much later. The castration ban was never primarily framed, in the surviving sources, as an act of compassion toward the enslaved boys subjected to the procedure. It arrives couched in different language, moral distaste at the luxury culture surrounding eunuchs, disgust at the merchants who profited from mutilating children for sale, concern about the corrupting decadence such trade represented for Roman society's self-image. Domitian, whose reign is remembered by the biographical tradition as erratic and often savage, was capable of extraordinary casual violence toward those beneath him elsewhere in his rule, which makes this particular intervention feel less like a coherent philosophy of protecting enslaved bodies and more like a targeted moral campaign against one specific and visible symbol of excess. The protection that resulted was real, and it mattered enormously to the boys who would otherwise have been subjected to the knife. But its motivation sat closer to elite anxiety about decadence and reputation than to any developed notion that an enslaved person's body was inviolable. This matters because it establishes a pattern that recurs throughout the story of these Roman limitations. Legal protections for enslaved people tend to arrive wrapped in justifications that are not really about the enslaved person at all. They arrive because a practice offends elite sensibilities, because it threatens public order, because it creates an economic distortion the state wants to correct, or because a particular emperor wants to be remembered as a moral reformer rather than as someone who tolerates a grotesque trade flourishing under his rule. The dignity of the person being protected is, more often than not, a byproduct of these other motives rather than their driving force. And yet the byproduct was consequential. A boy who might, in the year 60 CE, have been sold into a merchant's hands and subjected to castration for the eunuch trade could, by the year 90 CE, at least in principle, not be, or if he was, the transaction itself became a criminal act exposing the merchant and potentially the owner to prosecution. Whether enforcement matched the letter of the law in every province, in every back alley where such trades might still be conducted quietly, is a separate question, and the honest answer is that enforcement of any Roman law protecting enslaved people was patchy at best, dependent on informers, on local magistrates' willingness to act, on whether anyone with standing to complain ever learned what had happened. Rome did not have police in the modern sense, no organized apparatus dedicated to rooting out illegal castration operations in the provinces. A ban that exists on papyrus and in the jurist commentaries is not the same thing as a ban enforced uniformly across an empire spanning 3 continents. Still, the existence of the law shifted the default. Before the ban, castrating a slave for profit was simply a business decision, as unremarkable in the eyes of the law as branding a slave's forehead to mark him as a runaway or having him whipped for insolence. After the ban, it was a crime, something that had to be hidden, something that exposed the perpetrator to risk. That shift, from unremarkable to criminal, from a private property decision to a matter the state claimed jurisdiction over, represents exactly the kind of boundary drawing this account has been tracing since Chapter 2. Another crack, deliberately made this time by an emperor who wanted it made, in the once total edifice of Dominica Potestas. There is a broader category worth placing this within, bodily protections more generally, beyond just the castration ban specifically. Roman law, across the 1st and 2nd centuries, slowly accumulated a handful of other bodily protections for enslaved people, though none so dramatic or so well documented as the eunuch trade prohibition. Legal sources from the classical period discuss restrictions on exposing sick or elderly slaves to die of neglect, a practice that had been common enough that Emperor Claudius, in the 1st century, issued a ruling connected to a famous case involving slaves abandoned on the Tiber Islands sacred to the healing god Aesculapius when their owners no longer wished to pay for their care during illness, declaring that any slave so abandoned who survived would become free, and that a master who killed a sick slave outright to avoid the trouble and expense of caring for him could face prosecution for murder. This ruling sits alongside the Antonine reforms discussed in the previous chapter as part of the same broader current. An accumulating recognition, however grudging, however wrapped in the language of public order and elite propriety rather than compassion, that an enslaved body was not infinitely disposable at an owner's whim. None of this added up to bodily autonomy in any sense a modern reader would recognize. An owner could still order a slave whipped for minor infractions, could still brand a slave's face as punishment for running away, a practice that persisted legally even as more extreme mutilations were curtailed, could still work a slave to exhaustion in agricultural labor or mining conditions that amounted to a slow, sanctioned form of bodily destruction the law never touched, because that destruction happened gradually, through labor rather than a single dramatic act, and Roman law was far, better at recognizing and regulating single dramatic acts than it ever was at recognizing systemic, grinding harm. The castration ban protected against one specific horror while leaving countless others entirely legal. That is the pattern this entire 12-chapter account keeps circling back to. Real boundaries, drawn for real, if often self-interested reasons, inside a system that remained, in its totality, a machine for extracting human labor and human bodies for the benefit of those who owned them. By the time the jurist Ulpian and his contemporaries were writing in the early 3rd century, compiling the legal opinions that would eventually feed into Justinian's Great Digest 2 centuries later, the prohibition on castration had become settled law, cited without controversy as an established limit on what an owner or a trader could lawfully do. It had outlived the emperor who issued it, and outlived the specific cultural moment of elite eunuch collecting that had prompted it. It had become, simply, part of the fabric of what Roman law considered permissible and impermissible with respect to the enslaved body, a small, hard-won boundary, etched into a system that otherwise granted owners extraordinary latitude, and a reminder that even the most seemingly absolute forms of domination in history have, upon closer examination, edges someone eventually drew. It is worth dwelling further on the scale and geography of the trade this ban was aimed at, because understanding its size helps explain why an emperor would bother legislating against it at all. The eunuch trade of the early empire was not a marginal curiosity confined to a handful of eccentric collectors. It stretched across a supply network reaching from Roman-controlled territory in Asia Minor, Syria, and the Armenian borderlands, regions where the practice of castrating boys for sale into palace and temple service long predated Roman conquest and had deep roots in earlier Persian and Hellenistic administrative traditions, through intermediary markets and into the households of the Roman aristocracy, and, especially, the imperial palace itself, where eunuch chamberlains would go on to hold real administrative influence in the later empire, controlling access to the emperor's person in a way that made their role, paradoxically, one of the more powerful positions an enslaved or formerly enslaved person could occupy in the entire Roman world. This paradox is worth sitting with. The very mutilation that Domitian sought to ban had, for the individuals who survived it and rose within the palace hierarchy, become in some cases a path toward proximity to supreme political power unavailable to almost any other category of slave. That such power existed downstream of the practice did nothing to make the initial act of castration, inflicted overwhelmingly on children too young to consent to anything, any less a violent seizure of bodily autonomy. But it does help explain why the trade persisted, and why banning it required sustained political will across multiple reigns rather than a single edict. The medical reality behind the practice also deserves acknowledgement, uncomfortable as it is, because it clarifies why the Roman state's intervention mattered as more than a symbolic gesture. Ancient castration, performed without anesthesia and with the surgical knowledge of the 1st century, carried a substantial mortality rate. Ancient medical writers themselves, including figures within the broader Greco-Roman medical tradition, acknowledged that a significant proportion of boys subjected to the procedure did not survive it, and those who did faced a recovery process that was itself an ordeal, followed by lifelong physiological consequences. The economic logic of the trade accounted for this mortality by pricing survivors at a premium precisely because so many candidates did not make it through the process alive, meaning that behind every eunuch successfully sold into a wealthy Roman household stood an unrecorded number of other enslaved children who had died in the attempt. This is the reality Domitian's price ceiling and prohibition were aimed at disrupting, and it is worth remembering when assessing how much weight to give the ban. Whatever the emperor's mixed motives, the practical effect of criminalizing the practice was to remove the economic incentive that had been driving this specific, lethal violence against enslaved children. There is also a comparative point worth making, because it sharpens what was and was not unusual about Rome's eventual prohibition. Castration for eunuch service was practiced across a wide range of ancient and medieval societies. In the Persian court, in Byzantine administration long after Rome's western half had collapsed, in later Ottoman and Chinese imperial systems, and in most of these other contexts, the practice was never banned. It was regulated, institutionalized, and in some cases expanded as a permanent feature of court administration for over 1,000 years after Domitian's edict lapsed with the fall of Roman authority in the West. Rome's ban, in other words, was neither the beginning nor the end of this particular form of violence against enslaved people in world history. It was a temporary, geographically limited, and imperfectly enforced interruption within the Roman legal sphere specifically, one that later Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, administration would itself eventually depart from as eunuch service became, once again, an entrenched feature of palace life in Constantinople by the 5th and 6th centuries. This should temper any inclination to read the Domitianic ban as part of a steady, linear march of moral progress. Roman and post-Roman history on this particular question moved backward as often as it moved forward, a pattern that recurs, in different forms, throughout this entire 12-chapter account of legal limits on slaveholding. Underscore. Chapter 9. The Role of the Prefect. Complaints against Cruel Masters. There is a scene that appears, in various forms, across the legal and historical writing of the 2nd century CE. An enslaved person, having suffered some extreme of cruelty at a master's hands, flees not to freedom. Flight in the literal sense remained a crime, and a captured runaway faced brutal punishment. But to a statue, specifically to a statue of the emperor, or to a temple precinct, somewhere that Roman religious and civic custom had marked as a place of asylum, where the ordinary rules of pursuit and recapture were suspended, at least long enough for a magistrate to take notice. This chapter is about what happened next, and about the office that increasingly found itself positioned as arbiter in these disputes. The prefect of the city, the prefectus urbi, and in some contexts the prefect of the watch, the prefectus vigilum, whose ordinary job concerned fire prevention and nighttime order in Rome, but who, over the course of the 2nd century, accumulated a strange and significant secondary role, hearing complaints from enslaved people about their treatment, and in some documented cases, ordering that a slave be sold away from a master found guilty of excessive cruelty. The core legal text establishing this practice comes down to us through the jurist Gaius, writing his institutes sometime in the mid-2nd century CE, a period generally associated with the reign of Antoninus Pius, whose broader reforms regarding the killing of slaves were discussed in Chapter 5. Gaius records, in a passage that has become one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for limits on Roman slaveholding, that it was not permitted for masters to treat their slaves with excessive and unreasonable cruelty, and that upon complaint of slaves who fled to a temple of the gods or to the statue of the emperor to escape a master's severity, the prefect of the city, in Rome, or the provincial governors, outside it, would investigate. If the cruelty or the starvation or the intolerable treatment alleged were found to be true, the magistrate could compel the master to sell the slave, so that the slave would pass to a different owner, with the crucial detail that the original owner still received the purchase price. This was not manumission. The state was not freeing the slave. It was, in essence, forcing a transfer of property from an owner deemed unfit to hold it to a new owner presumably more capable of treating a human being like, at minimum, a valuable asset worth preserving. It is worth pausing on how strange this mechanism is, viewed from either direction. Viewed from the perspective of someone hoping to find in Roman law an early flowering of human rights consciousness, the mechanism disappoints. The enslaved person who successfully proves horrific mistreatment does not walk away free. He is sold. He remains a slave, now simply the property of someone else, someone the state has not vetted for goodness so much as for a baseline willingness not to torture or starve what he owns. Viewed from the perspective of someone trying to understand Roman property law on its own terms, though, the mechanism is a genuinely remarkable intrusion into what had once been an owner's unreviewable domain. The state is saying, in effect, you do not have unlimited discretion over how you treat this piece of property, and if you exceed the limits we recognize, we will take the property away from you and give it to someone else, over your objection, regardless of the fact that you paid for it, and hold clear title to it. There is no other category of Roman property, no plot of land, no herd of cattle, no piece of furniture, subject to this kind of state-ordered forced sale on grounds of mistreatment. Only slaves, because only slaves could suffer in a way that eventually became legible to Roman magistrates as a wrong worth correcting. The practical mechanics of how a slave actually reached the point of lodging such a complaint deserve close attention, because the barriers were substantial and the process was never as simple as walking up to a statue and being heard. First, the slave had to physically escape the immediate custody of the household. No small feat for someone who might be watched, chained, or simply too exhausted and malnourished from the very abuse he was fleeing to manage a journey across the city or across provincial roads to reach a recognized place of asylum. Second, he had to know, or be told by someone, which statues, which temples counted as legitimate sanctuary. This was not universal knowledge freely available to every enslaved person, and how many never attempted the flight simply because they did not know the option existed is a question the sources cannot answer. Third, once at the sanctuary, he had to survive there, dependent presumably on the goodwill of temple attendants or passers-by for food and protection, while awaiting the attention of a magistrate who had countless other duties competing for his time. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, he had to make his case, had to articulate specific enough allegations of cruelty, starvation, or forced degradation. The sources mention specifically being compelled into prostitution or other degrading uses as grounds recognized alongside physical cruelty, that a Roman magistrate, himself very likely a slave owner, embedded in a culture that took slaveholding entirely for granted, would find compelling enough to act against a fellow property holder. This last point cannot be overstated. The prefects hearing these complaints were not neutral arbiters drawn from some population sympathetic to the enslaved. They were members of the same elite class as the masters being accused, men who very likely owned slaves themselves, managed large households themselves, and shared broadly the same cultural assumptions about the legitimacy of slavery as an institution that the accused masters held. For such a man to rule against a fellow elite slave owner required either an unusually compelling case, visible physical evidence of starvation or beating severe enough to be undeniable, or a political and social calculation that ruling against this particular master carried more benefit than cost, perhaps because the master's reputation was already damaged, perhaps because letting the situation continue risked wider public disorder or scandal that reflected badly on the administration of the city. And yet cases were heard, and outcomes are recorded, however unevenly, in the surviving legal tradition. The jurist tradition treats the Antonine ruling described above as settled and citable law by the time later jurists like Ulpian and Paulus are writing in the early 3rd century, which tells us it was not treated as a dead letter, an aspirational statement issued once and then ignored. It was cited, applied, and understood to be an ongoing feature of how Roman magistrates were expected to handle these complaints when they arose. There is also an important connection to be drawn here to the earlier Claudian ruling about sick and abandoned slaves discussed in the previous chapter. Both interventions, Claudius's ruling on abandonment and the Antonine-era procedure involving the prefects, share a structural similarity. Both involve an enslaved person reaching, physically, toward a symbol of imperial or divine protection, whether that is Aesculapius's island of healing or the statue of the emperor himself. And both involve the state stepping into what had been an entirely private relationship between owner and owned to impose some form of check. This recurring image of enslaved people using sacred or imperial spaces as leverage points against their owners suggests something about how these protections actually functioned in the Roman imagination, not as abstract legal rights that any slave could invoke anywhere, at any time, through any channel, but as narrow, geographically and procedurally specific escape valves, tied to particular sanctified locations and particular magistrates, that a desperate and resourceful enslaved person might, with considerable luck and considerable risk, manage to use. The risk should not be understated. A slave who fled to sanctuary and failed to make a convincing case, whose complaint was heard and dismissed as unfounded, exaggerated, or the product of an unruly and rebellious character rather than genuine mistreatment, faced return to the very master he had just publicly accused, now presumably angrier than before, with the law offering no protection against retaliation for having brought the complaint in the first place beyond whatever general prohibitions against gratuitous cruelty. already existed and had just failed to protect him. The gamble, in other words, cut sharply against the enslaved person attempting it. Success meant a new owner, still enslaved, but presumably safer. Failure meant returning to a master whose cruelty had just been aired publicly and who now had every reason to resent the slave who had aired it. It is also worth noting what this mechanism reveals about the broader Roman legal imagination regarding slavery. Namely, that the state's interest in intervening was never framed around the enslaved person's inherent worth or dignity as a human being in the way a modern human rights framework would articulate it. The framing, consistently, across the sources, is about excess, excessive cruelty, unreasonable severity, treatment that goes beyond what any reasonable person would consider legitimate discipline of one's own property. The baseline assumption embedded in every one of these rulings is that ordinary discipline, beating, restraint, forced labor under harsh conditions, all of it, remained entirely within an owner's rights. What the prefects were empowered to correct was only the outlier case. The master whose behavior had become so extreme that it threatened to embarrass the household, disturb public order, or offend the increasingly influential Stoic-inflected moral sensibilities of the elite class that is the subject of Chapter 11. A master who worked his slaves brutally hard, fed them adequately but minimally, and punished them regularly, but not to the point of visible maiming or starvation, had nothing to fear from any prefect. The bar for intervention sat extremely high, calibrated not to protect enslaved people from the ordinary harshness of enslavement, but to catch only its most extreme and visible excesses. Still, taken together with the Antonine reforms on killing discussed earlier, this procedure represents one of the clearest institutional mechanisms Rome ever developed for enslaved people to seek some form of redress against their own owners through the machinery of the state, rather than relying entirely on flight, rebellion, suicide, or simple endurance as their only responses to abuse. That an enslaved person could, in principle, force a hearing before a Roman magistrate and force a change of ownership away from a master proven guilty of extreme cruelty represents a genuine, if narrow and unevenly enforced, boundary drawn around Dominica Potestas, one more thread in the slow unraveling of the idea that a master's power over his human property answered to no one. It is worth expanding on how this mechanism functioned outside the city of Rome itself, because the geography of the empire mattered enormously to how reliably any of these protections actually reached the people they were meant to help. Within Rome, the prefect of the city held a fixed, well-known office, staffed and resourced, with an established location where complaints could be lodged and a reasonably predictable schedule of hearings. Outside Rome, across the vast expanse of provincial territory stretching from Britain to Syria, the equivalent authority fell to the provincial governor, a figure who might be based hundreds of miles from any given estate, who typically toured his province according to an assize schedule that brought him to any particular town only once or twice a year, and who arrived with an entourage, a docket already crowded with tax disputes, property litigation, and criminal matters brought by free citizens with far more social standing and far louder advocates than an enslaved petitioner could ever muster. An enslaved person on a rural estate in Gaul or Cappadocia, hoping to bring a cruelty complaint, faced a journey to reach the governor's circuit, a wait for the circuit to arrive if he could not travel far, and a hearing squeezed into an overloaded docket presided over by a man who, unlike the city prefect operating under the immediate gaze of the imperial court and the Roman public, faced far less scrutiny over how seriously he took a slave's complaint against a locally prominent landowner he might have to deal with again at the next assize. The formal right existed everywhere in the empire, in other words, but the practical likelihood of a slave successfully exercising it varied enormously depending on simple proximity to Rome and to the routine machinery of provincial administration. Another reminder that a right recorded in the Institutes of Gaius did not translate into anything like uniform protection across the breadth of Roman territory. The evidentiary dimension of these hearings also deserves closer attention, because Roman legal procedure carried a feature that complicates any comfortable reading of this mechanism as a genuine forum for the enslaved to be heard. The long-standing rule, inherited from earlier Roman practice and never fully abandoned even as these cruelty complaints developed, that the testimony of a slave was considered inherently less reliable than that of a free person and, in many contexts, was only admissible in legal proceedings if extracted under torture, on the theory, stated openly by Roman jurists, that a slave's fear of his master made his voluntary word untrustworthy, while his testimony under torture was somehow to be trusted precisely because pain was believed to compel truth. It remains a genuinely difficult question, one the surviving sources do not resolve cleanly, how a magistrate weighed a fleeing slave's own account of his mistreatment against this backdrop of formal skepticism toward enslaved testimony generally. The likeliest answer, based on how these cases are described in the broader legal tradition, is that visible physical evidence did much of the evidentiary work that testimony alone could not. Scars, untreated wounds, visible emaciation from starvation, the corroborating word of neighbors, other slaves, or freedmen who had witnessed the treatment firsthand and whose accounts might carry more weight, or whose own testimony might in turn be compelled. A complaint resting solely on the fleeing slave's own uncorroborated word, without any visible or corroborating evidence, faced a much steeper climb toward being believed at all, embedded as it was within a legal culture that had spent centuries training itself to discount the enslaved voice as a source of reliable fact. Set against other ancient legal traditions, the Roman mechanism still stands out as unusually developed. Earlier Near Eastern law codes, including provisions found in the Code of Hammurabi and later Near Eastern legal traditions, addressed slavery extensively, but rarely constructed anything resembling a standing institutional channel through which an enslaved person could initiate a formal state review of an owner's conduct and obtain a change of ownership as a remedy. Most such codes focused instead on regulating slave sale, debt bondage, and the rights of owners against third parties who harmed or harbored their slaves, treating the slave himself overwhelmingly as the object rather than the initiator of legal process. Classical Athenian law, for its part, developed a scattered handful of religious sanctuary provisions with some resemblance to Roman practice, but nothing approaching the systematized prefectural review process Gaius describes. Viewed against this wider ancient landscape, the Roman procedure represents a genuine, if imperfect, innovation, evidence that by the 2nd century, Roman administrators had begun to conceive of at least some enslaved grievances as falling within the proper business of the state to adjudicate, rather than remaining entirely a private matter between an owner and the human property he happened to hold. Chapter 10, Manumission. The legal path owners couldn't fully block. Manumission, the formal act of freeing a slave, sits at an odd crossroads in Roman law, because it is simultaneously the clearest proof that Roman slavery was not, in a technical legal sense, an inescapable and permanent condition assigned at birth or capture, and one of the most tightly regulated and restricted processes in the entire legal system, hedged about with age requirements, numerical caps, and procedural formalities that had almost nothing to do with the enslaved person's welfare, and almost everything to do with controlling the size, composition, and civic status of the freed population that manumission continually generated. This chapter is about a genuine, meaningful limitation on owners. Once certain formal channels of manumission had been properly initiated, an owner could not simply reverse course, and various legal safeguards existed to prevent owners, heirs, and creditors from obstructing or subverting a manumission that had been validly begun, particularly manumission granted by will. But it is also about the deep ambivalence built into Roman manumission law from the start, an ambivalence that reveals the state's priorities were never primarily about the enslaved person's freedom for its own sake, but about managing manumission as a phenomenon with real consequences for Roman demography, security, and the integrity of citizenship itself. Start with the mechanics. Classical Roman law recognized several formal methods of manumission, each with distinct legal effects. Manumissio vindicta involved a collusive lawsuit before a magistrate, in which a third party would claim the slave as free, the owner would not contest the claim, and the magistrate would rule the slave free. A legal fiction wrapped around what was, in substance, simply the owner's voluntary act, dressed up in litigation because Roman formalism required action to occur within recognized procedural categories. Manumissio censu involved enrolling the slave on the citizen census rolls with the owner's consent, an act that itself constituted freedom, since the census rolls were, by definition, a register of free persons. Manumissio testamento, manumission by will, allowed an owner to specify that a slave would become free upon the owner's death, either immediately and unconditionally or contingent on some further condition, such as years of continued service to an heir. Each of these methods, once properly executed according to its formal requirements, produced full Roman citizenship for the freed slave in most cases, an extraordinary feature of Roman slavery, almost unique among slaveholding societies across history, where a freed slave and his descendants could, within a generation or two, hold formal Roman citizenship, vote, and in some cases rise to genuine social and economic prominence. But formal citizenship achieved through manumission was, from a very early point, something the Roman state grew anxious about, and that anxiety produced two major pieces of Augustan-era legislation that shaped manumission law for the rest of the classical period: the Lex Fuefia Canina of 2 BCE and the Lex Aelius Sentia of 4 CE. The Lex Fuefia Canina addressed a specific worry, that owners, particularly at the moment of death, were manumitting slaves by will in numbers that seemed, to the law's framers, excessive, sometimes freeing the entirety of a large household in a single testamentary act, whether out of genuine generosity, a desire for post-mortem prestige, and a grand funeral procession of newly freed clients honoring their former master, or simple carelessness about the civic consequences of flooding Rome with new citizens of servile origin. The law responded by capping the number of slaves an owner could manumit by will, on a sliding scale tied to the total size of the household. An owner with a very small number of slaves could free all of them, but as the size of the household grew, the proportion that could be freed by a single will shrank, with an absolute ceiling regardless of how enormous the household was. The stated purpose, as later jurists explain it, was to prevent Rome from being overwhelmed by an undesirably large influx of freedmen, understood as a status group the elite viewed with some suspicion regarding their fitness for the responsibilities of citizenship and their loyalty to Roman civic order. The Lex Aelius Sentia, following a few years later, added further restrictions, this time focused less on quantity and more on the qualifications of both the slave being freed and the owner doing the freeing. It established a minimum age for the slave, generally 30 years old, below which manumission through the formal channels that conferred citizenship was restricted unless a special council reviewed and approved the case on grounds of just cause. It similarly restricted owners under the age of 20 from manumitting slaves through those same formal channels without similar review, on the theory that a young owner might act rashly, out of momentary affection or manipulation, without the maturity to weigh the civic consequences properly. It also targeted a specific abuse: owners attempting to manumit slaves specifically to defraud creditors, hiding assets by converting them into freedmen rather than let them be seized to satisfy debts, a maneuver the law explicitly voided, treating such manumissions as invalid and the freed person as remaining enslaved for purposes of creditor claims. And it created an entirely new, lesser category of freed status, Juni and Latin status, for slaves manumitted informally, outside the recognized formal channels, or in violation of the law's age and procedural requirements, granting them practical freedom and the ability to earn and hold property, but withholding full Roman citizenship and, notably, the capacity to pass on citizenship equivalent rights to their own children or to make a will disposing of their property to anyone but their former owner upon death, a status frequently described by legal historians as a kind of intermediate, second-class freedom, free enough to work and live independently, but never fully absorbed into the citizen body. All of this legislation, read together, tells a story that cuts somewhat against any simple narrative of Rome protecting the manumission process for the sake of the enslaved. The Fuefia Canina and Aelius Sentia laws are, first and foremost, restrictions. They make manumission harder in various ways, not easier, and their explicit purpose, as ancient sources and later legal historians consistently describe it, was to control the flow and quality of new citizens, not to advance any right of the enslaved to eventually be free. An owner who wanted to free his entire household of 200 slaves in one grand gesture was now legally forbidden from doing so, regardless of how sincerely he wished it. That is a restriction on manumission, not a protection of it. So where does the actual protection this chapter is named for come in? It comes in at the point after a valid manumission, one that complied with these numerical and age restrictions, had been properly initiated, particularly through a will. Roman law developed a body of doctrine around what happened when heirs, executors, or other interested parties tried to obstruct, delay, or outright refuse to carry out a testamentary manumission that the deceased owner had validly ordered. The general principle that emerged, articulated across various rescripts and juristic opinions compiled in the later legal tradition, was that heirs could not simply refuse to honor a valid grant of freedom in a will. The freedom took effect by operation of the will itself once the will was probated and the conditions, if any, were satisfied. And an heir who tried to keep the newly freed person enslaved despite the testator's clear direction could be compelled by a magistrate to recognize the manumission. Jurists developed the doctrine of fideicommissary manumission specifically to close a loophole that clever owners or heirs might otherwise exploit, where a testator asked an heir, in a legally non-binding but morally weighty request, to free a slave rather than commanding it outright through the strict legal formula. Later legal reform made these requests enforceable as well, so that an heir could not evade the testator's evident wish simply because the language used fell short of the strictest formal requirements. Similarly, where a testator had manumitted a slave conditionally, freedom contingent on serving an heir faithfully for some further period of years, for example, the heir could not indefinitely extend, distort, or manufacture pretexts to avoid the arrival of that condition once it had genuinely been met. The slave's claim to freedom, once the condition was satisfied, became enforceable against the heir's wishes. There is a further protection worth noting connected to manumission during an owner's lifetime through vindicta and censu. Once these formal, magistrate-witness procedures had actually been completed, the resulting freedom was final and irrevocable in the ordinary case. An owner could not, on a change of heart the following week, simply reclaim a slave he had formally manumitted through vindicta, precisely because manumissio vindicta operated through the legal fiction of a judicial declaration of free status. The magistrate had ruled, and a magistrate's ruling on status was not something a private individual could simply undo by himself. This stands in real contrast to countless other decisions an owner made about his slaves, which remained entirely reversible and unreviewable at his sole discretion. Manumission, once validly completed through recognized formal channels, was one of the few property-related decisions a Roman owner made about a slave that the law treated as genuinely final and beyond his own subsequent power to reverse. The Junian Latin category deserves a closer look on its own terms, because it illustrates just how carefully Roman law calibrated the gradations of freedom it was willing to extend, and how reluctant it remained to grant full citizenship except through channels it could tightly control. A Junian Latin, the term derives from the lex unia, the statute traditionally credited with formalizing this status not long after the Iliacentia reforms, occupied a genuinely strange legal position. Free in the sense that no one could force him back into slavery, free to work, to travel, to accumulate his own earnings and possessions during his lifetime, yet permanently barred from Roman citizenship unless he later qualified for one of a handful of specific paths the law carved out toward upgrading his status, such as marrying and raising a child to a certain age, completing a term of service in the city's grain supply, or undertaking certain kinds of civic-minded commercial ventures the state wished to encourage. Most strikingly, a Junian Latin could not make a valid will. Whatever property he had accumulated during his life reverted, upon his death, not to his own chosen heirs, or even necessarily to his own children, but by default to his former owner or that owner's heirs, as though the property had never fully left the master's household at all. A rule jurist described using the memorable phrase that Junian Latins lived as free men but died as slaves, their estates snapping back into their former owners' control the instant they drew their last breath. This detail alone should complicate any reading of the manumission reforms as steadily expanding freedom in a straightforward, linear way. The lex Iliacentia's Junian Latin category functioned, in significant part, as a mechanism for extracting the practical benefits of a slave's freed labor and industry during his lifetime, while preserving the former owner's ultimate claim on whatever wealth that freed labor produced. The demographic anxiety underlying both the Fufia Caninia and Aelia Sentia legislation is worth taking seriously on its own terms as well, because it reveals something about how the Roman governing class actually thought about the freedmen they were creating. Augustus, in whose reign both laws were passed, was in the midst of a broader legislative program aimed at reshaping Roman social and family life. Laws regulating marriage, adultery, and the inheritance rights of the unmarried sit alongside the manumission statutes as part of the same general Augustan project of using law to engineer the composition and character of the citizen body. Roman writers of the period, and the jurists who later commented on this legislation, describe a specific fear animating the manumission restrictions, that the freed population being generated by manumission, drawn disproportionately from enslaved people of non-Italian, often Eastern Mediterranean origin, was diluting what these writers regarded as the proper stock of Roman citizens, introducing into the citizen body people whose loyalty, whose customs, and whose fitness for the responsibilities of Roman civic life the elite viewed with open suspicion. This is, in other words, not merely bureaucratic population management in a neutral, technocratic sense. It carries an unmistakably exclusionary character, an anxiety about who counted as properly Roman that shaped exactly how generous or restrictive the law would be about converting slaves into citizens. The eventual freedom a slave might win, in other words, was never disentangled from a set of elite anxieties about ethnicity, loyalty, and civic worthiness that had nothing to do with the freed person's actual character or conduct. It is also worth noting how freedmen, who did successfully navigate the full formal path to citizenship fit into Roman society thereafter, because their position illuminates both how far manumission could carry a person and how far it still fell short of erasing the mark of prior enslavement. A fully manumitted freedman gained Roman citizenship, could vote in most assemblies, could conduct business, marry freely, and see his own children born after manumission enter the world as citizens without any of the restrictions that had applied to him. Some freedmen accumulated genuine wealth, particularly in trade and commerce, occupations the traditional landowning senatorial class considered somewhat beneath its own dignity and therefore left more open to freedman enterprise. The wealthy freedman merchant became enough of a recognizable social type that Roman satirical literature repeatedly mocked him as a figure of tasteless, ostentatious new money, forever unable to fully shed the stigma of servile origin no matter how much wealth he accumulated. Informal legal restrictions persisted even for the most successful freedmen. They remained barred from holding senatorial rank themselves, though their grandsons, born to citizen fathers with no personal experience of slavery, faced no such bar and could, in principle, rise into the highest ranks of Roman public life within 2 generations of a household's initial enslavement. A genuinely remarkable feature of Roman social mobility by ancient standards, and one that stood in sharp contrast to the far more rigid, hereditary, and racially coded slave systems that would develop many centuries later in the early modern Atlantic world, where legal enslavement, once established along racial lines, offered no comparable 2-generation path back into full civic equality at all. It is worth closing this chapter by returning to what this protection actually meant in practice for the vast majority of enslaved people in Rome, which is to say, very little, most of the time, for most people, because the protection only activated once an owner had already decided to manumit and had gone through the correct formal channels to do so. Nothing in Roman law compelled any owner to manumit anyone, ever, at any point, for any reason. There was no path by which a slave could sue for his own freedom on the grounds of good service, or accumulated years, or any entitlement independent of his owner's voluntary choice. Except in the narrow circumstances discussed in earlier chapters, successful complaint to a prefect resulting in forced sale, not freedom. The peculium accumulating enough that an owner chose, but was never obligated, to accept it as payment for manumission. The legal protections around manumission discussed in this chapter protected the integrity of a process an owner had to choose to begin. They did nothing whatsoever for the slave whose owner never intended to free him at all, which, For the overwhelming majority of enslaved Romans working fields, mines, and workshops across the empire was very likely the entire and permanent condition of their lives. Chapter 11. Public Opinion and the Weight of Reputation. Not every limit on what a Roman owner could do to a slave came from a statute, an imperial rescript, or the ruling of a prefect. Some of the most important restraints on cruelty in Roman households never appeared in any legal code at all, because they operated through a different mechanism entirely: the fear of what other people would think. Rome was, at every level of its elite society, a culture of intense mutual observation. Dinner parties, public baths, the daily ritual of the morning salutatio in which clients called on their patrons, the theater, the courts, the streets themselves. These were not private spaces in the modern sense, but arenas of continuous social performance, where a man's treatment of his household, including his slaves, formed part of the evidence by which his peers judged his character, his self-control, his fitness to be taken seriously as a person of standing. A master who behaved with visible, gratuitous cruelty toward his slaves in front of guests risked something almost as powerful, in a status-obsessed society, as legal punishment. He risked being talked about, mocked, quietly excluded, remembered unfavorably in the very forums where political and social advancement were won and lost. The clearest window we have into this dynamic comes from the philosopher and statesman Seneca, writing in the middle of the 1st century CE, in a series of letters addressed to his friend Lucilius. One letter in particular, generally numbered among the collection as Epistle 47, has become one of the most frequently cited pieces of ancient writing on the treatment of the enslaved, precisely because Seneca argues, at length and with evident personal conviction, against the casual cruelty he observed in Roman households of his day. He describes dinner parties at which masters ate lavishly while their household slaves stood silent and hungry nearby, forbidden even to speak, and argues that this arrangement reflects poorly not on the slaves subjected to it, but on the character of the masters who impose it. He reminds Lucilius that the enslaved are, in Seneca's framing, fellow human beings who happen to have been overtaken by misfortune, that any Roman citizen of standing could, through the reversals of war, piracy, or political catastrophe, find himself enslaved in turn, and that a wise man treats his household with the same measured consideration he would want extended to himself under a different roll of fortune's dice. It would be a mistake to read Seneca's letter as evidence that Stoic philosophy had somehow produced a movement for the abolition of slavery, or even a broad-based elite consensus against its cruelties. Seneca himself owned slaves, managed a large household, and nowhere in his surviving writing does he suggest that slavery as an institution should be dismantled. His argument is confined entirely to how a master should treat the people he owns, not whether he should own people at all. But the letter matters enormously as evidence of something else, that by the middle of the 1st century, there existed, among at least a segment of the educated Roman elite, a genuine and articulate moral vocabulary for criticizing gratuitous cruelty toward slaves, one that drew on Stoic ideas about shared human reason and the arbitrary nature of fortune, and that this vocabulary was not confined to Seneca alone, but reflected a broader current of thought moving through elite Roman circles during the 1st and 2nd centuries, a current that would eventually feed into and help explain the legal reforms of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius discussed in earlier chapters. Reputation operated as a restraint through several concrete channels worth naming individually. The first was simple gossip and social judgment among peers. A master known for excessive brutality became, in the language the sources use, a kind of cautionary figure, discussed and disapproved of at exactly the social gatherings where reputations were made and unmade. The historian and biographer accounts of the early empire preserve a memorable episode involving a wealthy Roman named Vettius Pollio, a friend of the Emperor Augustus, who reportedly kept a pool of man-eating eels into which he would order slaves who displeased him, for offenses as minor as breaking a piece of glassware during a dinner party, to be thrown and devoured, as a form of both punishment and spectacle for his other guests. The story, as preserved in the tradition, culminates in a scene where a slave, having broken a cup, flees to Augustus himself, present at the dinner as a guest, and begs for a different form of death, any death, rather than being fed to the eels. Augustus, appalled, reportedly ordered the slaves spared, ordered every piece of glassware in Pollio's household smashed on the spot so that the offense could never recur, and had the eel pool filled in. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of every detail in this famously vivid anecdote, its preservation and repeated retelling across Roman historical writing tells us something important. This was understood, even by the standards of a slaveholding elite thoroughly comfortable with routine violence against the enslaved, as a story about excess, about a man whose cruelty had crossed a line recognizable even to his own social class, and about an emperor whose intervention was remembered, approvingly precisely because it corrected that excess. The second channel through which reputation operated was more structural. The Roman institution of the patron-client relationship and the broader system of political advancement through public reputation, which meant that a man's household was never simply his private domain, sealed off from public scrutiny, but was instead a visible extension of his public character, observed by the clients who called on him each morning, by the guests who dined at his table, by the slaves themselves who, upon eventual manumission, a live possibility for many urban household slaves, as the previous chapter discussed, would carry stories of their former master's household out into free society, where those stories could circulate, could reach the ears of people whose opinion mattered to the master's political and social standing. A former slave freed into citizenship, now a client with his own network of relationships, remembered exactly how he had been treated, and Roman social convention actually expected freedmen to maintain public deference and even affection toward former masters who had treated them decently, deference that could be conspicuously, tellingly absent in cases where the former master had not. The third channel was religious and moral, connected to the broader currents of Stoic and, somewhat later, emerging Christian thought that increasingly framed excessive cruelty toward any human being, enslaved or free, as a moral failing with consequences beyond mere social embarrassment. Consequences for the cruel man's own soul, character, or standing before the gods. This current runs alongside and reinforces, without fully displacing, the more purely social mechanism of gossip and reputation, and by the time Christianity became a significant cultural force within the empire from the 3rd century onward, this moral vocabulary would grow considerably louder, even as the legal institution of slavery itself persisted essentially unchallenged for centuries more. It is important, in surveying all of this, not to overstate its practical force, and the honest limits of this chapter's subject deserve as much attention as its substance. Public opinion is, by its nature, an inconsistent and unevenly distributed restraint. It worked best, and most visibly, within elite Roman households in the city of Rome itself and other major urban centers, where a man's social standing depended heavily on continuous, close observation by his peers, and where a dinner party audience existed to witness and later discuss what happened at his table. It worked far less well, or arguably not at all, on the vast agricultural estates and mining operations scattered across the provinces, where an owner or his overseer might operate with essentially no elite social audience present to judge his conduct, where the enslaved workforce toiling in a Spanish silver mine or an Italian latifundium had no dinner party witnesses whose gossip could reach anyone who mattered, and where the sheer brutal physical conditions of labor, conditions the ancient sources themselves describe in terms of horror when discussing mining slavery specifically, persisted essentially unchecked by any of the social pressures that might have moderated behavior within a fashionable urban household. Reputation, in other words, protected the enslaved unevenly, concentrated overwhelmingly among the visible domestic slaves of the wealthy, the cooks and secretaries and body servants whose treatment might actually become dinner party conversation, while leaving the much larger and more brutally exploited population of agricultural and industrial slave labor almost entirely outside its reach. It is worth tracing this moral vocabulary a little further forward in time, because Seneca was neither the first nor the last voice in this current, and the trajectory of the broader conversation matters to understanding how public opinion continued to press, gradually, on elite behavior across the following centuries. Earlier Stoic philosophy, reaching back to its Hellenistic founders well before Seneca's own lifetime, had already developed the foundational idea that all human beings shared in the same universal reason or logos, regardless of their civic or legal status. An idea that, in principle, sat in obvious tension with a legal system built on treating some humans as property, even though the Stoic tradition, across its long history, largely declined to draw that conclusion explicitly or to campaign against slavery as an institution. Seneca inherited and popularized this framework for a Roman aristocratic audience, translating abstract Greek philosophical premises into pointed, practical advice about how a Roman paterfamilias ought to run his own dinner table. His younger contemporary and fellow Stoic, the philosopher and former slave Epictetus, brought a different and rarer perspective to the same tradition, having lived through enslavement himself before his eventual manumission, and his surviving teachings, recorded by his student Arrian, dwell extensively on the philosophical meaning of being subject to another person's arbitrary power, teachings that, again, stop short of condemning slavery as an institution but that clearly carry the lived authority of someone who had experienced its indignities directly, and whose later prominence as a respected philosopher, sought out by Roman senators, and eventually even discussed favorably by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, itself testified to how far a formerly enslaved person's reputation could travel within Roman intellectual life by the 2nd century. Marcus Aurelius himself, ruling in the latter half of the 2nd century and steeped in this same Stoic tradition through his own philosophical education, extended some of the legal reforms discussed in earlier chapters and is recorded by later legal sources as having reinforced protections around the treatment of slaves brought before magistrates, continuing the pattern established by his predecessor Antoninus Pius. The philosophical current and the legal current, in other words, were not fully separate streams. They fed each other, with each generation of Stoic-influenced administrators bringing the moral vocabulary developed in letters and lecture halls into the more concrete business of issuing rescripts and hearing legal cases, even as neither stream ever crossed into a general condemnation of slaveholding itself. The geography of this pressure deserves the same scrutiny already applied to the legal mechanisms discussed in earlier chapters. Reputation as a restraint on cruelty depended entirely on an audience capable of exercising social judgment and willing to do so, which meant it operated with real force only within the tightly networked, status-conscious world of the Roman senatorial and equestrian elite, concentrated in the city of Rome, in a handful of other major cities across the empire, and in the country villas where that same elite entertained one another during seasonal retreats from the city. A wealthy landowner managing estates in the countryside of Italy or the provinces, but whose social and political ambitions were tied entirely to his standing among his peers back in Rome, had every reason to moderate his behavior when hosting dinner parties in the city, where the audience that mattered to his career was watching, while having comparatively little reason to extend that same moderation to the enslaved overseers and field laborers on his rural estates, who lived and worked far outside the gaze of anyone whose opinion could affect his political fortunes. The historical record bears this pattern out reasonably well. The anecdotes of elite restraint and reputational consequence that survive in the sources, the Vedius Palio story, Seneca's letter, the various juristic references to complaints heard by city and provincial magistrates, cluster overwhelmingly around urban, domestic, visible slavery, while the much larger population of Roman slaves engaged in agricultural and mining labor left behind comparatively little record of any equivalent social restraint reaching them at all. There is a final irony worth noting before closing this chapter, one that recurs throughout the entire subject of this 12-chapter account. The social pressure Seneca and others articulated, and that figures like Augustus in the Vedius Palio story enforced through their own considerable social authority, was never a pressure toward freedom, toward questioning the legitimacy of owning another human being at all. It was a pressure toward moderation, toward a kind of enlightened self-interest dressed in the language of shared humanity. Treat your slaves reasonably well, Seneca argues, not chiefly because they possess some inherent right to decent treatment independent of your will, but because doing so reflects better on you, makes for a more harmonious household, and acknowledges a truth about fortune's unpredictability that any wise man ought to keep in mind. It is a genuinely humane sentiment, as far as it goes, and it undoubtedly improved the daily experience of countless enslaved people living within reach of its influence. But it never once, in any surviving source from this period, extends to the conclusion that slavery itself might be wrong. That conclusion, when it eventually arrives centuries later in other contexts, arrives from entirely different intellectual and moral foundations than the ones Seneca, Augustus, or any other figure examined in this chapter ever articulated. Chapter 12, Conclusion, the boundaries that still allowed horror. 11 chapters have now traced a single, consistent thread. The idea, common in popular imagination, that a Roman slave owner possessed absolute, unreviewable, unlimited power over the people he owned, the power to kill without consequence, to maim without restraint, to do literally anything, to anyone, at any time, simply because Roman law classified that person as property rather than person, turns out to be an oversimplification. It was true, more or less, in the earliest centuries of Roman law, when Dominica Potestas approached something close to the popular image. It became progressively less true across the late Republic and, especially, across the first 3 centuries of the Empire, as a genuine, if scattered and unevenly enforced, body of legal and social restraint accumulated around what an owner could do. Owners could not, after Petronius and Augustus's legislation discussed in Chapter 3, simply condemn a disfavored slave to the arena to be torn apart by beasts without at least the formal involvement of a magistrate. Runaway slaves, discussed in Chapter 4, could in certain circumstances find sanctuary at an imperial statue or a temple, a physical and legal space where the ordinary rules of pursuit did not fully apply. After the Antonine reforms examined in Chapter 5, killing a slave without legally recognized cause moved from being an act of property destruction, answerable to no one, toward being treated as something approaching murder, answerable to the state. The peculium, discussed in Chapter 6, gave slaves a form of practical, if not formally titled, property that owners faced real customary and eventually legal restraint against seizing arbitrarily. Family bonds among the enslaved, examined in Chapter 7, however legally unrecognized in the formal sense, came to enjoy growing customary and eventually legal protection against casual separation through sale, particularly as the empire matured. Domitian's ban on castration, the subject of Chapter 8, placed the first clear criminal prohibition on a specific, irreversible bodily mutilation inflicted purely for commercial gain. The office of the city prefect, examined in Chapter 9, gave enslaved people who survived to reach it a formal, if narrow and risky, channel for seeking removal from an owner proven guilty of extreme cruelty. The manumission protections discussed in Chapter 10 ensured that once an owner had validly chosen to free a slave through recognized legal channels, he or his heirs could not simply renege on that choice. And the social and philosophical pressures examined in Chapter 11, however unevenly distributed and however disconnected from any genuine critique of slavery itself, meaningfully shaped the daily conduct of at least the visible, urban, domestic slaveholding elite. Taken together, this is a real and substantial body of limitation, and it would be a disservice to the historical record to pretend otherwise, or to flatten Roman slavery into an undifferentiated mass of pure, unregulated horror indistinguishable across its 700-year legal history. The Rome of the early Republic, in which a paterfamilias held something close to a formal power of life and death over every member of his household, slave and free child alike, without meaningful outside review, was not the same legal universe as the Rome of Antoninus Pius or the later Severan jurists, in which specific killings could be prosecuted, specific mutilations were criminalized, specific complaints could reach a prefect's court and result in an owner losing his human property against his will. That evolution happened, was documented by contemporary jurists and historians, and deserves to be understood accurately rather than erased in either direction, neither exaggerated into something resembling a proto-humanitarian legal system, nor dismissed as though it never occurred at all. And yet, has to carry real weight, or the entire preceding 11 chapters risk becoming an unintentional apology for the institution they describe. Every single one of these limitations operated inside a system that remained, at its foundation, unchanged in its most essential and defining feature. A human being could be legally owned by another human being, bought, sold, inherited, worked without limit, denied any formal legal personhood, denied the capacity to marry, to own property in his own name, to testify in court except under torture, to refuse any labor demanded of him, to raise his own children with any legal security against their sale to a stranger in another province, and denied, above all, any right to simply walk away and live as his own master. None of the 11 preceding chapters touches this foundation. Every boundary examined in this account is a boundary drawn inside slavery, regulating its administration, curbing its most visible and reputationally damaging excesses, protecting the state's interest in public order and the elite's interest in its own self-image, but never once, in any Roman statute, any imperial rescript, any philosophical letter, questioning whether the underlying relationship of ownership was itself legitimate. Consider what the pattern actually protected against, and consider, with equal honesty, what it left entirely untouched. It protected against the arena and against gratuitous, spectacular killing, but it left ordinary, unspectacular killing under the broad and pliable category of just cause, essentially at an owner's discretion for centuries, and even after the Antonine reforms. An owner who claimed disciplinary necessity for a fatal punishment retained enormous latitude that a modern observer would recognize as functionally unrestrained. It protected against castration for the luxury trade, but left branding, flogging, chaining, and every other routine instrument of discipline entirely legal and entirely at an owner's discretion, applied daily across the empire without any magistrate's involvement whatsoever. It gave slaves practical control over a peculium. But that peculium remained, in the strictest technical sense of Roman property law, the master's property all along, held only by his continuing sufferance, revocable in law even where custom discouraged revocation in practice. It protected family bonds from the most casual and arbitrary separations by sale, but did nothing to prevent separation when an owner's genuine financial distress, or simple preference, made sale seem necessary, and did nothing whatsoever to give an enslaved family any legal standing to resist. It gave a mistreated slave who survived long enough to reach a prefect's court a chance at a new owner, but never a chance at freedom, and the bar for what counted as intervention-worthy cruelty sat high enough that the ordinary, grinding harshness of slave labor across the vast majority of the empire's enslaved population, laboring in mines, on latifundia, on ships, never came close to qualifying. And it created, through manumission law, a genuine and remarkable path to citizenship for those slaves whose owners chose, for whatever mixture of affection, self-interest, or social calculation, to free them, while leaving every slave whose owner made no such choice with no legal path to freedom at all, ever, ordained by nothing but the sale documents, and the fortune or utter absence of it, into which they had been born or captured. This is the honest reckoning this closing chapter owes its subject. The boundaries were real. They were also, without exception, narrow, unevenly enforced across the vast geographic and social range of the Roman Empire, weighted overwhelmingly toward protecting the interests and reputations of the owning class rather than the dignity of the owned, and entirely compatible, in their totality, with a system that continued to treat millions of human beings, across 7 centuries of Roman history, as property first and people only incidentally, only at the margins, only when an owner's excess became too visible, too reputationally costly, or too disruptive to public order for the state to comfortably ignore. What, then, is the value of tracing these boundaries carefully, as this account has tried to do across 12 chapters, rather than simply stating at the outset that Roman slavery was a brutal institution and leaving it there? The value lies precisely in what the boundaries reveal about how systems of domination actually operate and actually change, which is rarely through sudden, comprehensive moral awakening, and much more often through this slower, messier, more compromised process. A law here restricting one specific abuse for reasons having little to do with the abused, a philosopher's letter there, articulating a moral vocabulary that would take centuries to develop its full implications, an emperor's rescript, issued as much to manage public order or economic distortion as to protect anyone's welfare, that nonetheless leaves behind a precedent later jurists could build on, cite, and gradually extend. Understanding Roman slavery accurately, its genuine, if narrow, internal limits alongside its fundamental, unaltered brutality, offers a clearer picture of how deeply embedded, economically entrenched systems of human exploitation actually get reformed at the margins across centuries without ever being abolished at the root, and why the presence of such reforms, however welcome to the individuals they protected in any given case, should never be mistaken for the presence of justice. The Rome that banned castration for profit still permitted the routine, industrial-scale brutality of mining slavery that consumed human bodies by the thousands in conditions ancient writers themselves described in terms bordering on horror. The Rome that let a tormented slave flee to an emperor's statue and, if fortunate, be sold to a gentler owner, offered that same slave no path whatsoever to simply cease being a slave unless his owner chose otherwise. The Rome whose elite dinner party culture increasingly frowned on visible, gratuitous cruelty toward one's household servants was the same Rome whose economy, whose agriculture, whose mines, whose entire material prosperity rested on the forced, uncompensated, and permanent labor of a population numbering, by conservative modern estimates, in the millions across the empire's territory at any given time. It is worth placing this Roman pattern briefly alongside other slaveholding societies in world history, not to rank atrocities against one another, an exercise with little value, but to notice a structural similarity that recurs across very different times and places. Legal limitation and fundamental brutality are not opposites that cancel each other out, but companions that regularly coexist within the same system, because a system that depends economically on coerced human labor has every incentive to regulate the excesses that threaten its own stability, its own reputation, or its own supply of laborers, while having no comparable internal incentive to abolish the coercion itself. The antebellum American South developed its own scattered body of statutory limitation on what an owner could do to an enslaved person, restrictions on certain forms of killing, occasional requirements around minimal food and shelter, even as the underlying institution retained its full and often intensifying brutality across the same period, hardening rather than softening in its final decades. Ottoman, Islamic legal traditions developed their own distinct body of jurisprudence regulating manumission, the treatment of enslaved concubines, and the rights of certain categories of slaves, operating according to religious and legal logics quite different from Rome's, yet arriving at a broadly similar structural outcome: meaningful boundaries on treatment. No comparable challenge to the legitimacy of the underlying institution until pressures external to the system itself, abolitionist movements, changing economic structures, international political pressure, eventually forced the question in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Rome's 12-chapter story, in other words, is not an isolated curiosity of ancient law. It is one instance of a pattern that recurs wherever legalized human bondage persists long enough to develop its own internal jurisprudence, and recognizing the pattern helps explain why internal legal reform, on its own, essentially never dismantles a slave system from within. It takes something else, usually pressure from outside the system's own logic entirely, to do that. What, then, is the value of tracing these boundaries carefully, as this account has tried to do across 12 chapters, rather than simply stating at the outset that Roman slavery was a brutal institution and leaving it there? The value lies precisely in what the boundaries reveal about how systems of domination actually operate and actually change, which is rarely through sudden, comprehensive moral awakening, and much more often through this slower, messier, more compromised process. A law here restricting one specific abuse for reasons having little to do with the abused, a philosopher's letter there, articulating a moral vocabulary that would take centuries to develop its full implications, an emperor's rescript, issued as much to manage public order or economic distortion as to protect anyone's welfare, that nonetheless leaves behind a precedent later jurists could build on, cite, and gradually extend. Understanding Roman slavery accurately, its genuine, if narrow, internal limits alongside its fundamental, unaltered brutality, offers a clearer picture of how deeply embedded, Economically entrenched systems of human exploitation actually get reformed at the margins across centuries without ever being abolished at the root, and why the presence of such reforms, however welcome to the individuals they protected in any given case, should never be mistaken for the presence of justice. There is one more thread worth pulling before closing, because it connects the ancient material of this account to a much longer historical arc. Roman law, including every one of the limitations examined across these 12 chapters, did not simply vanish with the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century. It survived, was rediscovered, studied, and codified anew across medieval and early modern Europe, most influentially through the rediscovery of Justinian's 6th century digest, which preserved and transmitted much of the classical jurisprudence discussed throughout this account: the Antonine rulings on killing, the manumission statutes, the procedural details of the peculium, into the legal education of medieval universities, and, eventually, into the intellectual foundations of early modern European legal thought. When early modern European powers began constructing their own colonial slave codes in the Americas from the 16th century onward, many of the jurists and administrators drafting those codes were themselves trained in a legal tradition that traced directly back to Roman law, and they drew, sometimes explicitly, on Roman categories and Roman precedent in shaping the new, and in crucial respects far harsher and more rigidly hereditary and racialized, systems of chattel slavery that would define the Atlantic world for the next 3 centuries. Rome's boundaries, in other words, became part of the intellectual inheritance that later slaveholding societies drew upon, sometimes to justify greater restriction, sometimes, notoriously, to justify the absence of restrictions Roman law had actually contained. Colonial administrators and jurists writing new slave codes did not uniformly adopt Rome's protective limitations even where they borrowed its property law logic of ownership, producing systems in some respects more absolute in their disregard for the enslaved body than the Roman system. This account has spent 12 chapters examining. That, too, is a sobering thing to sit with. Not every later system inherited Rome's edges along with its foundations. The Rome that banned castration for profit still permitted the routine, industrial-scale brutality of mining slavery that consumed human bodies by the thousands in conditions ancient writers themselves described in terms bordering on horror. The Rome that let a tormented slave flee to an emperor's statue and, if fortunate, be sold to a gentler owner, offered that same slave no path whatsoever to simply cease being a slave unless his owner chose otherwise. The Rome whose elite dinner party culture increasingly frowned on visible, gratuitous cruelty toward one's household servants was the same Rome whose economy, whose agriculture, whose mines, whose entire material prosperity rested on the forced, uncompensated, and permanent labor of a population numbering, by conservative modern estimates, in the millions across the empire's territory at any given time. The boundaries this account has traced were real. They were also never anything close to freedom, and they were never intended to be. That distinction, between a system that limits its own cruelty at the margins and a system that relinquishes the power to be cruel at all, is the distinction this entire account has been circling, chapter after chapter, and it is the distinction worth carrying away from it above every other detail examined here. Good night, and thank you for walking through this history with me tonight. What we've traced across these 12 chapters is not a comfortable story, and it was never meant to be one. Rome did not invent kindness toward the enslaved, and it did not come close to inventing freedom for them either. What it invented, slowly, unevenly, and almost always for reasons that had little to do with the enslaved person's own dignity, was a set of edges, places where an owner's power ran up against something else. A magistrate's authority, a prefect's review, a philosopher's letter, a price ceiling meant to starve out a trade in mutilated children. Each edge mattered enormously to the individual lives it touched. None of them added up to justice. That's the tension worth sitting with as this account closes. It would be easy and false to tell this story as a tidy arc of moral progress. Rome starting cruel and ending almost humane, each emperor a little more enlightened than the last. It would be just as false, and just as easy, to say none of it mattered, that a law banning castration or a prefect's court hearing a cruelty complaint changed nothing, because slavery itself never ended. The truth sits in the harder space between those two stories. Real boundaries were drawn. Real horror remained legal and routine on the other side of every one of them. Both things are true at once, and a history that only tells you one of them isn't telling you the whole thing. If there's a single thread to carry out of this into whatever you read or think about next, let it be this. Systems built on domination rarely fall from internal reform alone. They get regulated at the edges, sometimes by genuine moral pressure, more often by economic calculation, public embarrassment, or a ruler's wish to be remembered well. While their foundation stays exactly where it started, load-bearing and untouched, until something from outside the system's own logic finally forces the deeper question. Rome never asked that deeper question. The boundaries we've spent these chapters examining are evidence of everything the Roman world was capable of noticing and correcting, and equally evidence of the one thing it never once seriously considered. That's a heavy note to end a day's reading on, so let it rest there for tonight. History like this doesn't need to be resolved before you close the page. It just needs to be carried honestly, and you've done that by sitting with all 12 chapters rather than settling for the simpler, more comfortable version of the story. Rest well tonight. Whatever tomorrow brings, more research, more writing, or just an ordinary morning, I hope it's a kind one. Thank you for the chance to help shape this history into something worth reading. Good night.